Chapter 295. The three Eastern Districts were the second branch of the Four Continents Foundation Hall. The room was about 400 square meters and was divided into numerous grid areas by light blue partitions that were half the height of a person. Desks and computers were placed in each area. It could be imagined that on a normal day, there must be countless amiable and lovely ladies here, answering the phone while quickly typing on the keyboard. In the midst of countless grateful voices, donations from various regions of the Federation continued to be channeled into the Foundation's account. However, today, the office area was quiet, or dead silent. There was no sound of typing on the keyboard, no phone ringing. Only some rapid breathing could be faintly heard, and the owner of those breaths was hidden somewhere. The fierce battle in the morning did not seem to have affected this place. The corridor between the two walls was full of bullet holes and corpses, but there were no traces left here. Even the green plants by the transparent floor-to-ceiling windows on both sides were still so gentle in the faint morning light. Sulu raised the Cayenne gun and held it parallel to his chin. Using the standard movement of the Federal Army, he aimed at the empty space in front of him that was filled with killing intent. He forced his way through the corridor because he did it unexpectedly. With the opponent's unpredictable speed and lethality, he rushed forward valiantly. The silence made him extremely vigilant. By Magnolia's soft voice in the earpiece did not sound again. The monitoring system inside the Foundation building was not taken back. He could not determine where those people were hiding in the three Eastern Districts. Behind the desk, or in the shadow of the green plants. The previous explosion made Sulu confirm that Macklin had chosen the secret passage to leave as planned. Since the secret passage was blown up, Macklin should have been forced to return to his room at this time. And to get to Macklin's room, the three Eastern Districts were an area that had to be passed through. The key was that the hurried footsteps downstairs made it clear to him that the armed forces in the building had begun to gather in his direction. If his movements were slow, the only outcome left for him would be to be surrounded by countless firepower, which would be a miserable end. The military boots slowly took 2 steps forward without making any sound. Sulu narrowed his eyes and slowly and steadily scanned every corner of the office through the scope of the Cayenne light machine gun without a trace of trembling. Suddenly, a green plant that was about the height of a person by the floor-to-ceiling window swayed. Under the cover of the morning light, a militant opened fire at him. Because of the sunlight, Sulu narrowed his eyes. Even though he knew that the other party had fired, he didn't make any evasive movements. He just steadily pointed the muzzle in that direction. With a few clear sounds, the wall beside Sulu was pierced with a few bullet holes. The wallpaper was filled with a burnt smell, and it began to flutter in the air. Almost at the same time, his finger pulled the trigger. Following the clear feeling of the recoil and the muffled sound, the green plants by the window scattered, and smoke rose. The green leaves scattered, and the militant who had been silently hiding behind them didn't even make a sound. He leaned back and fell to the ground. Sulu suddenly turned around and pulled the trigger at an extremely fast speed. He accurately shot through the light blue partition and killed a militant in the 11:00 direction on his left. He held the Cayenne light machine gun horizontally, narrowed his eyes, and fired quickly and accurately. In less than 7 seconds, more than 20 bullets had been fired, valiantly suppressing the militants hiding in the corners of the three Eastern Districts, making them unable to move. Occasionally, there were bullets whistling past his body, but his aiming speed was too fast. He just stood on the flat ground at the entrance of the three Eastern Districts. The Cayenne in his hand spat out flames at a certain rhythm. The militants didn't dare to poke their heads out, so naturally, there was no accuracy. But in such a battlefield, this guy actually dared to stand and break in. It could only be said that he had seen through life and death. He had already walked 7 steps into the three Eastern Districts. The back of the Cayenne hit his shoulder heavily. He didn't miss a single shot, and once again pulled the cold trigger on his finger. The sharp bullet line shot straight forward, bringing a cluster of light smoke, and shot the hand holding the gun that had just reached out from behind the desk into countless pieces of minced meat. Screams sounded. At the same time, intensive gunshots sounded, instantly shattering the dead silence in the office and the monotonous gunshots from before. Su Li's pupils suddenly shrank, and then he realized that the real firepower in this office was much more powerful than what was shown before. The personal armed forces of Macklin had been waiting until now, just to let him go deep into the 3 eastern districts, and there was no escape. The sky was full of bullets whistling. Su Li's face was pale, and the power in his body all burst out at this moment, and passed to the military boots. The soles of the boots bloomed in an instant, and the inhuman power stomped on the ground. The dark carpet was broken into pieces, and his body had already fallen back. He tightly curled up, and like a reverse arrow, he fell back toward the entrance. No matter how powerful a person was, he couldn't run faster than a bullet. He didn't know if Feng Yu or that old man Li's of Philadelphia could do it, but in Su Li's mind, normal people couldn't do this, so when the intensive gunshots sounded, he knew that he had no other choice but to dodge. In the air, he scattered the Cayenne in his hand with full power, continuously pouring bullets, wanting to suppress some of the firepower that had been waiting for this moment. While he was still in the air, 2 meters away from the entrance of the 3 eastern districts, Su Li's body had already shrunk, trying to reduce his size as much as possible. The barrel of the Cayenne in his hand had already started to turn red, and the office was filled with terrifying screeching sounds. A deeper gunshot sounded, and Su Li's body in the air seemed to have been hit by a heavy hammer. He flew back even faster and directly fell to the ground. He was shot 3 times, and the most fatal one was the last one in the chest, when the first gunshot sounded in the building of the 4 States Peace Foundation in S2. Gunshots also sounded in the distant S1 Charter Square, which was more solemn and dignified than usual. At the guardrail under the statue of the Group of 5 in Charter Square, a row of Federation soldiers in dark military uniforms stood there with solemn expressions. Their hands were tightly gripping the shiny metal guns in front of their chests. Their movements were beautiful and clean as they raised the guns over their shoulders, aimed at the sky, and fired. The gunshots were neat and uniform, as if one person was firing. As the gunshots spread out in spirals, the deliberately added colorful powder turned into white smoke in the clean winter air, and the gunfire was beautiful. The fat white pigeons on the lawn were already suffering from the cold winter, so they lazily hid in the pigeon house set up by the Square Management Center to keep warm. Suddenly, they were awakened by the crisp gunshots. Their instinct buried deep in their bones made them start to fear. Perhaps they thought of the miserable past of their ancestors being eaten by humans, so they all drilled out of the pigeon house and tried to fly away in horror. However, they were already too fat, and it was unknown whether the tips of their wings had degenerated or been cut off. How could they fly high into the snowy sky? They could only clumsily flutter around, looking like the pitiful hens in the ancient chicken farms recorded in movies. At the Parliament Square connected to Charter Square, a series of gunshots also sounded at this time. However, unlike the fat pigeons on the lawn, on both sides of the stone steps of the Parliament building, on both sides of the lake opposite the Parliament Mountain, on the lawn, the ordinary citizens who came to watch the ceremony, as well as the officials and parliamentarians on the viewing platform, all had smiles and pride on their faces. There was no trace of panic. This was the inauguration ceremony of the Federation president, not a funeral, so only a series of gunshots rang out, followed by the sound of cannon salutes. It was already 10 o'clock, and the rumbling of cannon salutes rang through the sky, waking up all the sleepy people in the Capital Special District. In fact, no matter how unconcerned they were with politics, or how much they ridiculed the Federation government, they would probably wake up today to watch this grand event. After all, it was a grand event that happened once every 5 years. In fact, the people of the entire universe, whether it was night time or dawn, were all watching Charter Square, Parliament Mountain, and the core of the Federation through television. The 2 connected squares at the front and back of Parliament Mountain were already filled with people, and people were whispering with joy. The Federation welcomed a new president, and in the context of great reconciliation, even the president's political enemies could not dig up any misdeeds, so the citizens of the Federation had high expectations for the new government. The news channel of the Federation TV station and a few other major television stations had already set up countless broadcasting stations, and the heavy cameras were like black holes of cannons, aimed at the people attending the inauguration ceremony, and transmitted the sincere or fake smiles on their faces to thousands of households. The wireless cameras that hovered around the viewing platform and the stone steps of Parliament Mountain were like loyal roaming sentries, vigilantly watching the surroundings and transmitting all the details that were worth paying attention to back to the broadcasting vehicles, such as the material of the oath-taking platform on the stone steps of Parliament Mountain, and the faces of the political bigwigs on the viewing platform. The viewing platform was connected to the stone steps of Parliament Mountain, and the old man who stood closest to the oath-taking platform was the President of the Federation Parliament. This Vice President cum President was ending his political career today, but looking at his expression, he was quite relaxed and at ease. Beside the President was naturally the Vice President, and the Vice President's expression was a bit heavy. After the new president was inaugurated, he still had to carry out his duties in the majestic Parliament building, and he just had to cooperate with the new president. Perhaps he was thinking about this, or perhaps he had already started thinking about the parliamentary election in a few years. A few members of the National Security Council were also at the back. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Federation, the commander of the 1st Military Region, General Miles, stood at the front with a cold expression, and beside him were the commanders of the 2nd Military Region and the 3rd Military Region. The cameraman of the Federation News Channel, wearing sunglasses, controlled the suspended camera on the arm and slowly flashed past the faces of these important people. These important people had been through who knows how many big scenes, and they maintained their facial expressions extremely well, without a trace of trembling at all. On the contrary, the staff in the temporary broadcasting center behind the Parliament building were excited by the familiar faces that flashed past on the camera. All the important people of the Federation government, Parliament, and military were present, and this was a rare scene. The female 3-star Federal Fleet General Hong Yuliang had come. This middle-aged female general who was used to drifting in the universe stood calmly in the crowd, unassuming, but exceptionally eye-catching, because everyone knew that she rarely landed on the surface of a planet in the past few years. During President Sieg's inauguration ceremony last time, she was still far away near the Bermuda Space Passage, and did not return to S1 at all. Who was the middle-aged general beside her, wearing a dark military uniform, with a cold and indifferent expression? The reporters in the broadcasting center looked at that face and simultaneously sucked in a cold breath. Commander Zhong of the 4th Military Region, far away in the West Woods, actually came as well. When did he arrive at the capital? Why was there no news yet? The leader of the 7 major families of the Federation and the most powerful military general of the Federation, who had been absent from 2 presidential inauguration ceremonies in a row, actually came in person this time. Tens of thousands of spectators had gathered in front of the Parliament Hill, but the focus of the news was still on the important people on the viewing platform. The citizens watching the news on TV curiously identified the identity and power of these important people, and they were unusually excited. The big shots on the viewing platform, the reporters in the broadcast center, the higher-ups of the major television stations who were watching all of this, and the reporters who were waiting to submit their manuscripts silently looked at the faces that were familiar, or should have been familiar, but had become somewhat unfamiliar. However, they were not as excited as the ordinary people. Instead, they felt a trace of a strange emotion, but this emotion was positive and encouraging. Everyone had arrived, even the eccentric General Hong and Commander Zhong, who had always been indifferent to the Federation, had arrived. This demonstrated an atmosphere of great unity that had never been seen before. In front of the threat of the Empire, after the turmoil of the 67th year of the constitutional era, all of the important people with foresight in the Federation felt the importance of unity. President Pabre's administration undoubtedly ushered in the most beautiful beginning amidst the resounding applause, excited shouts, and happy whistles. Mr. Pabre, the president-elect of the Federation, accompanied by his wife and President Sig, slowly walked from the side to the stone steps of the Parliament building. This was the first time Pabre stood at the highest point of the Federation, but this lawyer-turned-politician did not panic at all. He shook hands with President Sig, smiled, and whispered a few words, and then walked to the front of the oath stage. The sea of people in the square at the foot of the Parliament building immediately became even more excited, and the guests on the viewing platform also began to extremely politely applaud. President Pabre was born into a family of miners in the Donglin district. His difficult childhood and later arduous military career left behind dark marks on his face full of perseverance. And his 10 years of work as a public interest lawyer allowed his thick lips to say countless words that would make the hearts of the audience swoon. However, today, President Pabre said nothing. He only raised both of his arms, and raised them high towards the people in the square who passionately supported him. Gradually, the square became quiet. President Pabre narrowed his eyes and watched the dense crowd. He turned his head to look at his wife who had hot tears in her eyes, and then looked at his election partner, Vice President Byron. He cast a slightly simple and honest smile, and then turned his head back. After the collapse of the dynasty in the distant past, human society entered the stage of electoral politics. No matter how the name of society changed, whether it was the Republic or the Federation, but after so many years, only this presidential election gave the Federation people a very different feeling. Because in this presidential election, two outliers, Senator Pabre and Senator Macklin, had appeared. In countless years of elections, there had never been a story of a person without any family background, starting from the bottom of society, and standing on the glorious stage of Federation politics in one fell swoop. But this time, two people had appeared at once. President Pabre quietly looked at the people below the stage, and a trace of a smile appeared on his face. The wrinkles on his lips became very deep, as if they were carved with a knife. They were firm and gave people a feeling of trust. There were many people in the Federation who passionately supported him, at least not less than Macklin's support. However, in the election, this politician had always calmly controlled the emotions of his supporters, and in order to not let the Federation fall into chaos, he had carried out countless difficult and even somewhat passive efforts. However, reality proved that he was the final victor. My victory is the victory of the common people. President Pabre looked at the crowd below the stone steps and suddenly laughed loudly. His laughter was exceptionally free and unrestrained. After the laughter gradually stopped, he extended his right index finger and pointed at the people who were full of joyful smiles. His palm was broad and thick, and his fingers were slender and strong. He loudly said, "It is your victory. The victory of the common people, your victory." In the Winter Capital Special District, on Parliament Hill, Charter Square, the lawn, the calm lake, and every corner of the Federation, the miners who had been guarding the resource planet for several years, the warriors patrolling the border, the students in the dormitory, and all kinds of people were excited by these words. The cheers resounded in front of Parliament Hill, and the sound was deafening. Behind the oath-taking platform, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who was in charge of presiding over today's oath-taking ceremony, opened his sleepy eyes, as if he did not know what had happened. In an extremely inconspicuous position in the second-to-last row of the viewing platform, Lady Tai, wearing a black imitation leather coat, calmly looked at the president in the distance. She covered her mouth with her gloved right hand and coughed softly a few times. Hearing the cheers around her, she unnoticeably frowned. "This is the victory of the common people, this is your victory." On the news screen in the office, President Pabre was loudly saying these words. There was a sea of people in the square, and it was a magnificent sight. The white-haired Senator Macklin had a haggard expression on his face, but when he saw this scene, he could not help but laugh mockingly. He softly said, "An eloquent speaker who uses the common people as his clothes." As the loser of the presidential election, Macklin was not too dissatisfied to be able to escape unscathed. His haggard expression mainly came from waking up early that morning and the current situation he was in. This senator, who was highly respected by the people at the bottom of the Federation, wore a white shirt that was dyed with black and yellow spots. There was also a lingering stench that seeped out of his body. The news on the television continued. Not far away, the dense gunshots continued to sound, chilling to the heart. Senator Macklin's face was a little pale. He took a wet towel and wiped the dirt and dust on his body in disgust. Although his residence was behind the office, and there was a huge shower and the most luxurious wave jacuzzi, as the target of an assassination, he really did not have the mood or time to enjoy these things amidst the roaring gunshots. "We have to leave immediately, Mr. Senator," Macklin's confidential secretary said with a pale face and a trembling voice. "Since the other party can even blow up the escape tunnel, they must be a very large organization. Maybe they are people from the mountains. We don't know if the federal army will come to help. The security forces in the building alone will definitely not be able to withstand it." The moment the alarm sounded, the staff in the senator's office helped Senator Macklin, who had woken up early, into the secret tunnel and prepared to leave directly into the underground parking lot. However, no one expected that just as they were about to walk out of the secret tunnel, there would be a terrifying explosion above the tunnel. The power of the explosion directly collapsed the top of the tunnel, and 7 staff members in the senator's office died in the rubble. It was the cautious Senator Macklin who had deliberately waited until the end, and he managed to escape with his life. However, the dust, feces, and urine that were blasted out by the explosion still drenched the people who were lucky enough to escape with their lives. Senator Macklin frowned and glanced at his secretary. He thought of his secretary, Helen, and felt even more dissatisfied. However, Helen had already been killed by him in the terrorist attack, so there was no benefit in reminiscing about her past. The senator wiped his white hair with a wet towel and threw the smelly towel on the ground. He turned back to look at the strong soldier beside the chair and asked in a low voice, "How long until the helicopter arrives?" "The intruders are too fast. Even if the military receives the order to request for help, it will take at least 20 minutes. The soldier did not have an epaulet and did not belong to any department of the Federation government. He was Senator Macklin's most trusted subordinate, and had been Macklin's orderly many years ago. Later on, he began to lead the armed forces in the building to protect Senator Macklin's career in this universe. What do you suggest? Although Senator Macklin was in a sorry state, he still managed to maintain a calm expression. The continuous gunshots and the occasional explosion not far away could not make the weather-beaten old man panic. There are not many intruders. The internal surveillance confirmed that only one person entered the building, the soldier said in a low voice. One person? Macklin's brows furrowed, and he snapped rudely, "How is the safety work done? It's my fault. However, there is a very powerful sniper on the peak in the northeast." The soldier replied quickly and calmly, "Whether we evacuate from the ground now or wait for the helicopter to leave, it will be very dangerous. The sniper must be waiting for this moment. The Federal Army's conventional sniper weapons can't have such a long range." He continued to analyze, "I think it's an experimental ACW. Senator, I suggest that we stay in the building and wait for reinforcements." According to the feedback from the communication device, the reinforcements outside the building have rushed over. Since there is only one person, it is impossible for him to break into this room in front of our security forces. Then how did he break into the building? The secretary retorted sharply, and then suggested to the senator in a trembling voice, "That person must have other helpers. Mr. Senator, let's retreat first. Since the sniper outside has been exposed, the Special Task Force must be dealing with him now. The Special Task Force's response can't be slow, but it will take some time for the people to deal with the sniper to arrive. The key is, can those agents handle it?" The soldier glanced at the secretary and saluted Senator Macklin. "Comrade Senator, please believe in our strength and determination. There is a safe house in the office, and this is the safest place." "Okay." Senator Macklin did not think for long and agreed to the arrangement. He slowly sat back on the soft sofa and watched the presidential inauguration ceremony on the television tiredly. He said slowly, "Are you confident?" "Yes." The soldier said calmly, "That person has been surrounded at the entrance of the 3 eastern districts. Everyone is rushing over. Even if he is Li Pifu, only death awaits him today. After the first round of shooting, Shi Qinghai carried the heavy ACW and its accessories, stepped on the red leaves, and rushed to the foot of the mountain. He knew that his position had been exposed, and the enemy would definitely come to suppress him immediately. However, the reason he rushed down the mountain was not to change his sniping position, but to change his role in the plan today. He wanted to provide as much effective support as possible to Madman Su in the building. Breathing heavily and with heavy footsteps, Shi Qinghai ran all the way. He knew very well that the ACW in his hand could not determine the outcome of the battle, just like how the new MX mecha could not determine the outcome of the war between the Federation and the Empire. The agents of the Special Task Force were originally used to block bullets for important political figures. How could they be blocked by an anti-material rifle? Previously, Shi Qinghai's shooting at the top of the mountain had stopped the Special Task Force for 2 minutes. This was taking advantage of the mutual distrust between Senator Macklin's office and the government. However, only the commander of the Special Task Force would come to his senses and realize that he had failed in his duty. He would definitely rush to the building at all costs. The development of the facts was just as Shi Qinghai expected. The shadow of death could not stop the Special Task Force. When he rushed down the mountain, more than a dozen agents of the Special Task Force had already rushed into the building fearlessly, ready to block Su Li's escape route. The staff of the security company also rushed in with the Special Task Force. Shi Qinghai rushed to the foot of the mountain. He listened attentively to the gunshots in the building. His heart gradually became heavy, because the obvious muffled sound of the Cayenne gun had stopped, but the gunshots of the enemy were getting more and more frequent. After entering a suitable distance, Shi Qinghai reinstalled the ACW and pulled the trigger. The thick barrel had no fire, only smoke. 2 smoke bombs with long tails penetrated the glass wall of the 3 eastern districts of the Foundation building and fell in. Chapter 296. The dark ventilation duct was full of dust, and gunshots rang out from time to time. Several holes were shot in the metal ventilation wall, and thin pillars of white light shone in. It looked like an unreal scene. Su Lu dragged his travel bag and crawled in the ventilation duct. The design of the ventilation duct of the Foundation building was very strong, and it would never give intruders any chance to escape. Although the cautious Senator Macklin was no longer the tough soldier he used to be, he was very mature when it came to security. Warm blood flowed out from the wound, bringing with it dust, turning into a sticky substance, making people feel very uncomfortable. Su Lu breathed in the stale air and crawled quickly in the ventilation duct. He did not care about his wound and the pursuit that might be caused by the sound. In fact, he was still hiding in the 3 eastern districts and could not get rid of the omnipresent gunfire. In fact, he did not want to get rid of it, nor did he want to leave. He jumped down from the ventilation duct and landed on his left leg first. A sharp pain entered his brain and almost made him fall to the ground. This was the pantry of the office area, and no one was there for the time being. Su Lu sat down by the coffee machine and lowered his head to breathe quickly. Only then did he have a chance to see where he was shot. Earlier, he had been ambushed by the powerful armed men around Macklin in the 3rd East District. Then, the Special Task Force agents and more than 30 security guards from the security company rushed into the building and surrounded him. If he hadn't thrown the 4 rolling grenades and caused temporary chaos, he wouldn't have been able to escape from that place. Did he leave? No, the outside of the room was full of heavily armed enemies. As soon as he showed his head, he would definitely end up in a honeycomb. After a short breath, Su Lu felt that in addition to the wound on his left leg, there were also 2 painful places on his body. He looked down and saw that the trousers on his left leg had been completely torn, and a piece of shrapnel had cut directly under his knee. If it had been a little higher, his knee would have been shot, and it would have been difficult for him to walk. He was shot twice in the chest and abdomen, and the conical bullets were deeply embedded in the interlayer of his underwear. The huge impact compressed the 2 bullets and made them look like round platinum nails used by girls for decoration. Su Lu frowned and used all his strength to pull them down. He found that the place where he was shot was extremely painful. He didn't know if his ribs were broken. If it hadn't been for the thin, hard bulletproof vest from Whitewater Company, he would have already met George Carlin. Escaping from death, he didn't feel much joy. His heart was heavy. He took a deep breath and mobilized the scorching power behind his waist, causing his body to tremble. Especially around his injured left leg, the muscle fibers were forcefully squeezing and rubbing together, increasing the pain of the wound. Blood also spurted out, but for some reason, the wound gradually turned white, and no more blood flowed out. At this time, a very soft sound suddenly came from outside the pantry. Sulu clenched the cayenne in his hand and lowered his head to listen attentively. Although he couldn't confirm the number of people, he knew that it was definitely not a small number. He slowly lowered his body. Instead of hiding behind the door, he squatted on the other side of the door. Sure enough, there was a burst of concentrated gunfire. The high-density plastic door was instantly shot with countless holes by the gunfire outside the door, splashing wood and plastic shards everywhere. Sulu silently squatted at the bottom of the door, avoiding the spurting bullets and risking his life to wait. After the door was kicked open, Sulu didn't care about the first person with a gun at all. Instead, he flashed out from behind that person, raised his gun, and fired continuously, killing the two people in front of him. In the shortest amount of time, he threw himself under a cubicle desk. Just as he fell heavily to the ground, gunshots rang out in the office in the East 3rd District. A barrage of bullets rained down on his hiding spot. The bullets shattered the small decorations on top of the cubicle. The small crystal objects and dolls that the ladies liked to put in the office experienced a second brutal blow and were scattered in all directions. The light blue hard partition material, under such intense gunfire, gradually fell apart. Fortunately, it wasn't made of tofu slag. Although it didn't play a big role, it still resisted for a while. During this time, Sulu silently crawled toward the window in the smoke and gunfire. From the moment he rushed into the building, he had already put life and death behind him. But at this moment, accompanied by the shrill gunfire and the cold metal music, he really smelled the smell of death. Motherfucker. At this time, he couldn't raise his head at all. The whistling sound of the bullets around him mixed together and became a horrible sound. The hard objects that kept shattering around him reminded him that the human body couldn't withstand this kind of harvest of death. His mood was extremely cold and gloomy. He didn't even notice that the bullets that were shooting around once again hit his thigh. At this time, the floor-to-ceiling glass curtain of the 3 Eastern Districts suddenly broke. 2 metal objects flew in, instantly releasing a large amount of smoke that quickly enveloped the entire floor. Then 2 more smoke bombs were shot in, and the smoke became thicker. Even the things that were close to him couldn't be seen clearly. The dense gunfire that was moving in this direction suddenly became fierce and then sparse. Everyone in the office temporarily stayed in their positions and didn't move. The federal military provided a smoke bomb. Under the cover of the smoke, Sulu quietly moved his position and hid behind a safe with a pale face. With the knowledge of guns he learned from Magnolia, he easily recognized what it was that allowed him to live for a few more minutes. He knew that there was someone covering him outside the Foundation building, but it was not Secretary Bai. However, the effect of the smoke bomb could only last for 3 minutes. The well-trained security personnel in the building obviously knew this, so they didn't rush blindly. Instead, they occupied all the corridors and coldly waited for the smoke to disperse. Only 3 minutes to live. Sulu took a few quick breaths, lowered his head and wiped the blood on his face. He gently put the cayenne in his hand on the ground, took out the last 2 long pistols from the travel bag, and then slowly and steadily began to install the silencer. The biggest reason why today's operation was in such a precarious situation was because the Magnolia in the mountain had failed to successfully control the monitoring system in the Golden Foundation building again. Without the help of the monitoring system, Sulu was equivalent to a blind man, and the other party could clearly find his location. At this time, the smoke was extremely thick, and everyone became blind, blind for 3 minutes. But what would happen after 3 minutes? Sulu lowered his head and pursed his dry lips. His eyes narrowed, and there was a strange smile on his face. He didn't want to think about what would happen after 3 minutes. Uncle said that humans are the best machines. He wiped the cold sweat from his palms, took a deep breath, and tightly held the cold long handle of the pistol. He kept muttering to himself in his heart, "Sulu, you are a machine. You won't get hurt, you won't get tired." This was probably self-hypnosis when facing a desperate situation. Only in this difficult and dangerous environment would he not lose the last of his courage and confidence. However, no matter how much he hypnotized himself, he knew that his eyesight and hearing were better than the average person, but after all, he was not the omniscient and omnipotent creator, and he was not the eyes that could look down on all living beings. The people surrounding him were all well-trained professional soldiers and professional agents of the Special Task Force. He couldn't kill them with just the smoke. But he still had to stand up and finish this matter. So, Sulu frowned and tried not to think about the miserable wounds on his body. He exerted strength in his waist and abdomen, preparing to stand up and continue shooting. Then, he would be shot until he died. In the capital special district, in front of the Parliament Hill, countless people quietly watched the long stone steps on the oath platform with eyes full of concern. At this time, no one noticed that in the second last row of the viewing platform, there was a lady in a black coat. She received a phone call, and then a strange look flashed through her calm expression. In the same inconspicuous position of the viewing platform, the heads of the Lee family and the Lin family, who deliberately kept a low profile at this prominent moment, seemed to have received some kind of message at the same time. The expressions on their faces changed, and then they immediately returned to normal. They looked at the stone step seriously. "I solemnly swear that I will faithfully carry out the duties of the President, and use all my strength to protect the Charter of the Federation." Vice President Byron had finished his oath. At this time, the one who put his hand on the thick charter was President-elect Pabre. His voice was very stable, and his feelings were sincere. What followed was a 10-minute speech. "On this day, we are gathered together because we choose hope over fear, and meaningful unity over disputes and discord. On this day, we have come to declare that those useless complaints and false promises have come to an end. Those mutual accusations and old dogmas that have warped our politics for a long time have come to an end." President Pabre used a grave expression to watch the crowd in the square. "Under the threat of the empire, under the threat of the Federation's unfairness, should we sit and wait for the judgment of the Creator, or should we do our best to do something? In the history of the Federation, there has never been a lack of people who have pleaded for the people. And in the history of the Federation, in the face of the dark era and decadent oppression, there have always been people who dared to stand up and release their own roar. I admire this type of person. I want to tell these people that no matter where you are in the universe, as long as you respect the principles of the Federation and the spirit of the Charter, I welcome you to S1, to the capital, to the Federation government." Sulu didn't hear the content of President Pabre's speech. In the smoke and ruins, he prepared to stand up, but his pupils suddenly shrank, as if he saw something inconceivable. Chapter 297. That autumn more than 2 years ago, Uncle Feng Yu had put that bracelet on Su Li's wrist. From then on, many strange things had happened to him. He had swapped out the chip on the back of his neck. He had entered the black dream while unconscious, and in the dream, he had seen that great and terrifying existence. That existence had not erased his existence, but had instead been silently watching over him. Furthermore, at the crucial moment when he was fighting for the laboratory data, he had helped him. The Federal Central Computer, which had distributed the glory of the Charter, had once injected countless complex and advanced blueprints into his brain in order to awaken him from his coma. It was also by relying on these blueprints that Sulu had been able to enter the Shell Motor Company, and had played an important role in the Federation's development of the new MX Mecha. Sulu had asked himself countless times, why would such a bizarre encounter that only appeared in novels, a storyline that no one had ever imagined, happened to him. At first, he had been terrified, worried that the Federal Central Computer would recognize his identity as a fugitive and kill him at every moment. Later on, he had become numb and lost, and had some thoughts of throwing caution to the wind. His courage and directness in dealing with the things and people around him probably had something to do with this absolute sense of insecurity. After that, he had gotten used to the black dream that had appeared in his mind. That extremely polite old thing had spoken in a flat tone, and he had vaguely caught onto something. For some unknown reason, the cornerstone of the Federation's society, the glory of the Charter, which had spread throughout the universe, did not seem to want him to die. At least, he could not die now. Therefore, before he had come to S2 to do the most important thing in his life, he had mustered up the courage to initiate contact with the other end of the black dream. The other end of the black dream had reacted to him, but there had been no results. It was not until he had entered the interior of the Golden Foundation building, running for his life amidst the hail of bullets, that the great existence had once again appeared in his mind, in front of his eyes, by his side, and the moment it had appeared, it had given him endless shock. The architectural blueprints that appeared in Su Li's eyes did not shock him. The database of the Federation's central computer contained all the details of this world. Furthermore, he had long been used to the scene in front of his eyes. The more complicated architectural designs in the past also abruptly appeared in front of his eyes like this. Now, he naturally understood that this was not because he had epilepsy, nor was it because the bioelectric current in the chip behind his neck was disrupted. Instead, it was because the omnipotent central computer of the Federation was inputting data to him. What shocked him was the light spots in the blueprints, as well as the long series of citizen numbers on the light spots. Each light spot represented a person in the building. If one focused on the light spots would become clearer, revealing the outline of the human body. One could clearly see the location of the person and their movements. From this detail, it could be determined that not only did the Federal Central Computer use the chip to locate the specific location of everyone in the room, but it also directly used the highest authority to take over the Golden Foundation's internal monitoring network. What did this mean? This meant that at this time, Su Lu could clearly grasp every detail of the environment around him through his own eyes. The 3 eastern districts of the office were full of thick fog, reducing the visibility to the lowest level. Even if he used the infrared thermal imaging device equipped by the military, he was afraid that it would not be able to quickly distinguish between friend and foe. At this time, the blueprints in his eyes that could change at will and the light spots that represented the enemy seemed to have given him a pair of eyes that could see through the fog, even the walls and camouflage. In the world of the Federation, no one could escape the glory of the Charter. At this time, the glory of the Charter bathed Su Li's body. It was as if he had gained a pair of omniscient and omnipotent eyes that could overlook the world from space, capturing every detail and every target. Su Li's body felt a burst of coldness and an incomparably complicated heat. These two completely different emotions intertwined in his heart. He should have been incomparably excited because he had a perspective and ability that no one else in the universe could have, but he also felt endless fear. Why would the Federation's central computer grant him such terrifying authority and ability? What was hidden behind this matter? He had a pair of eyes that could see through everything and control everything. Could he still be considered a human? At the moment of life and death, even the cold and fear disappeared in an instant. With the blessing of the glory of the Charter, with such a pair of eyes that could see through everything, he might not have to die now and could finish the task at hand. Thinking of this, Su Li's whole body was hot and his face was pale. His narrowed eyes narrowed slightly as he stared at the empty fog in front of him. His body trembled slightly. In the heavy fog, he stood up, quietly and slowly took off his shoes, stepped on the debris on the ground, and walked into the depths of the fog. It was not his eyes that could see through all obstacles, heaven and earth, but the three-dimensional map in his left eye. With his subtle movements, the map that appeared in his left eye made subtle adjustments to its perspective, and the virtual blueprints were perfectly consistent with the surrounding environment in reality. To be able to achieve real-time data synchronization and scene reproduction, probably only the omnipresent and omnipotent Federal Central Computer could do it, right? His left eye clearly showed the number of enemies and their positions, and even their movements were clearly displayed. Su Le narrowed his eyes, put a pistol back on his waist, and held the long pistol flat with both hands. He slowly moved and aimed at a point in the depths of the fog. There was dead silence all around. No one knew the position of each other. The very military people did not shoot randomly, but silently blocked all the passages, waiting for the moment when the fog dissipated. The security personnel of the Foundation would never have thought that Su Le had stood up at this time. Su Le silently aimed at the depths of the fog. The cold muzzle pointed at the chaos, and nothing could be seen clearly. However, in his left eye, there was a virtual human body that could not be clearer. That person was holding a long gun and vigilantly leaning against a corner of the wall. Su Le pulled the trigger in his hand, and his wrist trembled slightly. The gun barrel made a very low chirping sound, and the bullet shot into the depths of the fog. There was still the sound of cement fragments and plastic fragments falling around, and there was a subtle breathing sound. The light of the light tube above could not penetrate the thick fog, and it was very vague. The gunshot after the noise was suppressed, and in this dangerous environment, it was very difficult to attract people's attention. The bullet shot into the depths of the fog, like a clay ox entering the sea, and there was no reaction. Su Le narrowed his eyes, but from the light in his left eyelid, he could clearly see that the person's forehead had been hit with a warm color. He leaned against the wall with his head tilted and did not move at all. He should be dead. He died silently, and only the row of citizen numbers above his head gradually dissipated and went with the wind. Su Le's pupils shrunk helplessly. In this situation, he actually felt a sense of helplessness. It had to be said that it was a very strange thing. He did not have any further reaction to the unreal feeling that was similar to a game. Instead, he relied on his strong and thick nerves to silently and slowly turn around again. He pointed the muzzle at another direction in the depths of the fog. He silently pulled the trigger again, and another life quietly left the depths of the fog. The fog could last for about 2 minutes, and there were still more than 20 militants hidden in the 3 eastern districts. The thick white fog looked like beautiful white clouds floating on the mountainside. It covered the top of the autumn forest and the living creatures in the forest. The clouds, the fog, and the sky could no longer cover Su Le's eyes. He walked into the depths of the fog without making a single sound. He was like a barefoot shepherd boy walking among the white clouds in the mountains. However, this shepherd boy did not harvest grass or feed cows. He harvested lives for the sake of stubbornly moving forward. This was a completely unequal and unfair one-sided killing. After losing Bai Yulan's instructions through the earpiece, Su Le became a blind man. Under the tracking of the Golden Foundation's internal surveillance network, he was in a very sorry state and even miserable state as he constantly fled. He was like a mouse caught by countless stray cats. No matter how he struggled, he would still end up dead in the end. But at this time, his eyes saw light again, and what he saw was great light. He could see everything around him, but nothing around him could see his true appearance. In the cloud-like fog, he walked barefoot. Every time he stepped on the ground, he was extremely careful and did not make the slightest sound. Even if he stepped on a few sharp fragments and blood began to flow from the soles of his feet, he only frowned slightly and did not have the slightest reaction. The 2 gunshot wounds on his legs also affected his speed and pace. Relying on his superhuman muscle strength and control, he dragged his injured leg and silently and valiantly walked into the depths of the fog. He raised his gun and looked straight ahead, silently firing, and killed the enemies hidden in the fog, in the corners, and next to the file cabinets one by one. After Su Le shot and killed 6 people, the rest of the people in the 3 eastern districts finally felt a trace of strangeness and a chill from the depths of their hearts. They did not know that many of their companions had quietly died, but the faint smell of blood that was faintly getting stronger and stronger, the occasional sound of touching, and the occasional soft chirping from time to time made them faintly guess what was going on. The highly trained militants and the Special Task Force agents, who were responsible for the security of VIPs, realized that there was a huge problem with the situation at the scene almost at the same time. Almost at the same time, they could no longer bear the feeling of impending death in the silence. They chose the most dangerous, but also the most courageous and most effective method. After confirming each other's positions briefly with the internal communication device, the gunshots in the 3 eastern districts exploded in an instant. Dense bullets once again flew in the air, weaving into countless firepower nets that shrouded the entire area. After the silence was broken, there were muffled grunts, screams, and hurried calls. This place became a noisy and dangerous battlefield. They no longer cared about whether or not they would cause serious injuries. They only hoped that with their lives, they could take down the terrifying intruder hidden in the fog. In just a moment, several armed militants were killed or injured by their own gunfire. Just before the gunfire erupted again, Sulu lowered his body in advance through the omniscient and omnipotent vision of his left eye. He dragged his heavily injured leg and quickly made his way to the left side of the fog. He was sure that there were no enemies here, and there was a safe here. He shrank his body behind the safe and held the gun with his head down. He listened to the whistling sound of bullets in the air in front of him and felt the environment around him where hard objects were scattered. He maintained absolute silence. The great light in his left eye could see the figures who raised their guns and fired into the fog. He could see where they were aiming, so in this chaotic and dangerous shooting, he was not hit. However, there were still a few high-speed bullets that swept in front of him, splashing the carpet fragments on the ground and the cement debris under the carpet, making crackling sounds. After silently counting 10 seconds, Sulu raised his head that had been buried deep in his arms. He narrowed his eyes and aimed at a certain spot in the fog in front of him. He held the long case pistol with both hands to maintain absolute stability. Control the entrance of the passage. Give feedback on the situation. A cold voice came from the fog. The owner of the voice hid his body behind the fog and the desk, extremely cautious. Sulu narrowed his eyes and aimed at that spot. That spot was covered in fog, but his left eye had already seen through the smoke and the partition of the desk, accurately capturing the location of the other party. He gently pulled the trigger, and the bullet penetrated the smoke and the partition, accurately hitting the person's throat. Blood burst out of the person's throat, but Sulu only saw a warm color in a certain area with his left eye. The 3 eastern districts once again fell into a dead silence. The people's breathing became heavy, and they no longer deliberately suppressed it. This was because they found that no matter how they hid, it seemed that the intruder could find their location and kill them. In this dead silence, Sulu quietly moved toward one of the 2 exits under the cover of the fog. What the hell? In the temporary security command center in the auxiliary building of the Cultural and Arts Center, the captain of the Special Task Force of the Federation stared at the surveillance screen with a pale face, his tightly clenched fists trembling slightly. 7 surveillance cameras faithfully displayed everything that happened in the 3 eastern districts in front of his eyes. The problem was that all he could see at this time was only smoke. He could only hear the gunshots in the smoke and the sounds of all the combatants on his side dying. After all, the Peace Foundation was not a federal military base, and the Federation government would not give the building the authority to install a thermal imaging system. Even if there was, this member of the Special Task Force knew that at most he could see vague red and yellow figures in the smoke, but he could not distinguish between friend and foe. How did the intruder do it? At this time, he saw a picture from the corner of his eye. The door of the second exit of the 3 eastern districts flashed, and a guy in a guard uniform with a seriously injured left leg slowly walked out. Although this guy was not carrying the travel bag, the captain of the Special Task Force still recognized him at a glance. His pupils shrank slightly. Since this guy walked out of the smoke, what about the people in the smoke? The target is at the second exit. He forcibly suppressed the coldness and fear in his heart, stared at Sulu on the screen, and quickly issued an order. Block the front of the corridor and flank from the side. Then the captain of the special task force saw a scene that had frightened him for many years. Chapter 298. The existence and the glory of the charter didn't help Sulu enter the Federation's Special Task Force's communication channel, so he didn't hear the orders of the Special Task Force officer. He knew that security personnel would appear at the end of the side corridor, but he could see them. At this time, the walls and rooms inside the Foundation building had disappeared in his eyes. His left eye saw a row of virtual three-dimensional images. He could see the enemies running wildly behind the walls. Those figures condensed from light spots were turning back from behind the walls, trying to kill him from the side. Sulu turned around and raised his gun, aiming at the side exit in advance. The running speed of the people behind the walls made it easy for him to calculate when they would appear. 3, 2, 1. He pulled the trigger in his hand. The moment the three enemies appeared at the end of the corridor, the bullets arrived. 3 flowers of blood bloomed, and the 3 people's bodies leaned back violently and fell heavily to the ground. After doing this thing that shouldn't be possible for humans, Sulu dragged his seriously injured leg and walked forward. If he were an ordinary person with 2 bullets in the leg, he would have been unable to move long ago. But he was not an ordinary person, and the scene that happened before proved this. He just lowered his head, changed the magazine, and prepared for the next shot like a ghost. Walking through the dark corridor, he couldn't feel hesitant. Even if he had an indescribable feeling of confusion and fear about what happened to him, he was as careless and determined as ever. The moment he lowered his head and walked, he found that the road under his feet was more difficult than before, but also more comfortable. At this time, there was nothing that could stop his strong desire to finish this thing. He raised his hand and fired at will in the corridor, and the bullets were unrestrained, shooting down the people in front of him one by one. He walked straight forward without any worries. The world of freedom in his heart was not clear and lofty, but it was extraordinarily firm, blooming like a blood-colored flower that would never wither. In the 4 States Peace Foundation building, who knew how many blood-colored flowers bloomed? Sulu, dragging his injured leg, killed a bloody path and came to the outside of the room with the door closed. The image in his left eye flashed slightly, and it showed that there were 3 people in the room. One of them had just stood up from the sofa, and the citizen number above that person's head started with SLB looked very familiar. Although the Federation strictly protected the privacy of its citizens, this citizen number was no secret to Sulu. SL represented the Upper Forest region, while B represented S2. This person was Macklin. He was still in the room. It seemed that after the secret passage was blown up, Suli's speed of breaking through the 3 eastern regions was too fast, so this counselor did not seize the opportunity to leave. What a fool! Sulu sniffled and licked his dry lips. He raised the pistol in his hand and rested it on his wrist. He aimed behind the door and gently knocked on it. He stood in a very good position. He knew what the people behind the door were doing, and he also knew that there were still some security personnel who were trying to save Macklin's life. So he knocked on the door. As long as the person behind the door was a little further away from the wall, he could pull the trigger and directly kill that person. But it was clear that the bodyguard who was still with the counselor at the last moment was a very vigilant guy. Probably that person also knew that Sulu seemed to have some kind of strange ability, so he hid his body perfectly behind the wall and did not give Sulu any chance to shoot through. He's outside. The soldier with a cold expression leaned against the wall and said to Macklin, who was at the door of the office, "Counselor, you must go in immediately and close the safe house." Macklin's white hair was messy on the top of his head. The old politician silently looked at his most trusted subordinate, walked into the bedroom without hesitation, and pressed the button next to him. The sound of heavy components closing faintly came from behind the door. Suli's thick eyebrows twitched. He knew what this meant. In the original plan, he did not expect to be able to do anything before the counselor hid in the safe house. But the clear sound of metal components closing still caused small bumps to appear on his back. He raised the gun and fired 3 shots at the lock of the door at a speed that did not match the rhythm. After a slight pause, he kicked the door open, threw his body forward, and rushed in. Before he broke the door, he had already determined the location of that person. While he was in the air, the barrel in his right hand had already opened fire, shooting at the wall on the right. The soldier who had been standing silently behind the wall was still silent and indifferent. Both sides were tightly holding an old-fashioned pistol. There was no epaulette on his shoulder, and there was a sharp military knife at his waist. His eyes were calm as he looked in the direction of the door. The most trusted bodyguard of Macklin was able to break through the layers of defense inside the Foundation building. He knew very well that today's intruder was not an ordinary person, so he was fully prepared. He was even prepared for failure. Therefore, when the door was kicked open, he immediately fired a shot. His body, however, turned around at an incredible speed. The barrel of the old-fashioned pistol spewed out beautiful flames, shooting at the black shadow that broke through the door. Puff, 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 puff. The sound of gunshots intertwined and resounded in the luxurious office. Dust and debris flew everywhere, and bullet holes were clearly visible on the walls and the floor. Before the smoke accumulated in the deep holes could rise, the 2 figures had already wrestled together like 2 fierce tigers. Sulu did not hit the soldier without epaulets. The soldier had experienced countless life-and-death gunfights in his life. Although he had the help of the glory of the Charter, which gave him unparalleled vision and predictive ability, at the critical moment of life and death, the silent soldier smelled danger in advance. Relying on a soldier's instinct on the battlefield, he reacted and narrowly avoided the soldier's continuous shots. The soldier also did not hit Sulu. Although his evaluation of this intruder had risen to terrifying, he still did not expect that an injured person could actually react like a human when he was about to land on the ground. The moment Sulu landed on the floor, his left palm slammed down fiercely. Relying on the huge force of the rebound, his body was forcibly shaken and bounced forward in the air. The soldier's bullets all brushed past his body and hit the floor. The soldier's pupils shrank sharply. At this moment, he thought of his previous suggestion to the committee member. At that time, he thought that in the encirclement of the 3 eastern districts, even if the Lees of Philadelphia personally came, it would be impossible to break through alone. However, this small-eyed man did it. Without any hesitation, the soldier without epaulets rushed over with a solemn face. His left hand clasped Su Lee's right hand that was holding the gun, and his right hand holding the gun pressed against Su Lee's abdomen. At this time, Su Lee's left hand had already fiercely grabbed the soldier's right shoulder, and the long magazine pistol in his right hand immediately fired. All of this happened in the blink of an eye. The 2 of them used their excellent military qualities to spring up and fight each other, twisting their bodies together. The soldier ignored the gun in Su Lee's hand and bravely chose to die together with him. When people were not afraid of death, there were too many methods that could not be used. Su Lu, whose right hand was tightly grabbed, passively accepted the other party's invitation to die. He did not have time to think about anything else and subconsciously pulled the trigger. One was muffled, the other was crisp. 2 gunshots sounded almost at the same time, bursting out from the 2 people's chest and abdomen. The gunfire suddenly burst out in the narrow space. At such a close range, there was no way for anyone to dodge the shots. It was as if there were 2 very strong ropes tied around the waists of Su Lu and the soldier. The air in the office instantly froze, and the 2 people's bodies suddenly stopped. Then, they were hit by the huge impact of the bullet and were pushed back rapidly. The bullet hit the hard ceramic bulletproof vest, and it was unknown if it had penetrated it. The pale-faced Su Lu did not care about that. He even suppressed the huge pain in that area and the urge to vomit blood that was beginning to accumulate in his chest. The moment he fell, his right foot hooked the soldier's ankle, and he forcefully bounced up again. He fiercely used his knee to hit the soldier's knee. With a cracking sound, the soldier's knee broke. But the soldier's eyes lit up. He did not care about Su Li's violent and ruthless hand skills in a small area. His left hand shot out like lightning and firmly gripped the back of Su Li's neck. The barrel of his right hand was slanted upwards, pointing at the soldier's chin. Both parties were extremely cautious in wearing bulletproof vests. At the beginning, the violent shooting at each other at close range could not completely knock them down. But at such a close range, if someone were to shoot at the neck, no one would be able to survive. At this time, Su Li had already dropped the gun in his hand. There were no more bullets in the gun. He used the bend of his elbow to hit the soldier's collarbone. At the same time, he used the fastest speed to pull out the military knife that he had not used before. The all-black long case pistol fell on the floor with a bang. The two people who were tangled together in a dangerous situation also fell heavily to the ground. Like a flash of light, Su Li roared. His right hand tightly gripped the military knife and viciously stabbed at the soldier's heart from above. The soldier used his uninjured right leg to hold Su Li's body tightly. The muzzle of his right hand was in an extremely narrow range, pointing at the soldier's chin. A flash of light flashed in his eyes. It was the reflection of the military knife. He was not afraid at all. Because he was wearing a soft pottery bulletproof vest, it was enough to withstand the explosive strike of such a sharp cold weapon. Even if it could not block it, so what? If I die, you will die too. The soldier without the epaulets was very willing to use his own life to exchange for the other's life. After the flash of light in his eyes, there was a look of determination and relief. The sharp military knife pierced through the soldier's uniform and opened a small hole in the soft pottery bulletproof vest. It encountered an extremely strong resistance. It was like a bamboo pole that was stuck in a quagmire that was about to freeze in the winter. It was difficult to move forward, but it also could not be pulled out. The soldier's finger was already ready to pull the trigger. He was ready to see the flash of gunfire in front of his eyes and smash the head of the silent small-eyed man into pieces. Su Li's eyes were especially bright at this moment. They were squinting like the crescent moon. The sound of electric current was heard. The blue arc flashed at the front of the military knife. A look of disbelief flashed in the soldier's eyes. His finger on the cold trigger kept trembling, but he could not press it down no matter what. At the same time, his body began to tremble violently. A faint burnt smell filled the room. The valiant professional soldier, Su Li, who had powerful abilities, did not faint from the electric current. After a moment, the two people gradually regained control of their bodies. At this most critical moment, Su Li's face was abnormally pale. His eyes were abnormally bright. He extracted all of the strength in his body and transferred it to his limbs. He forced half of his body to stretch out. He used his elbow to remove the gun barrel that was pressed against his chin. His left hand pressed on his right wrist. Ah! He let out a fierce shout as he stared at the unfamiliar face of the soldier below him. He exerted all the strength in his body, transferring it from his hands to the sharp military knife in his hand. The military knife slowly broke through the soft pottery bulletproof vest. It sank down, bit by bit. It pierced the skin, pierced the flesh, slid past the ribs, pierced the joints, and slowly pierced into the smooth surface of the heart. The soldier without epaulets stared at the young man's face in front of him. He opened his mouth and wanted to make some sound, but could only make these unconscious sounds. He felt like there was a huge mountain pressing on his body. He felt like his sternum was all broken. He also felt like there was a fine needle gently pricking his skin. With a poochie sound, all the sharp military thorns pierced into his heart. The soldier's body trembled violently. Su Li lowered his head and pressed on the soldier's body, desperately suppressing the tremors. In the end, there was no more reaction. This soldier had followed Chairman Macklin for 20 years, from Green Dragon Mountain all the way to South Kazhou. He had killed countless people for the sake of the great cause of the committee. Although he didn't have epaulets, he was undoubtedly an absolute powerhouse on the battlefield. But today, when facing this small-eyed man, he did not expect that the military knife would have an electric current. He did not expect that the other party could have such terrifying strength to be able to pierce the bulletproof vest with the military knife. So he died. He died very thoroughly. Sulu struggled to get up. He didn't look at the soldier at his feet who was staring at him with wide eyes and the blood flowing out of his eyes. He just clutched his chest and dragged his heavily injured body into the office. On the way, he saw the secretary in the confidential room who was holding his head and trembling. He directly knocked him out. Walking into the luxurious bedroom and past the bathroom, Sulu narrowed his eyes and arrived at his destination today. This was a glass door that looked very weak. He lowered his head and greedily breathed in a few breaths of fresh air. Then, he pulled out the pistol in his hand, aimed at the glass door, and pulled the trigger repeatedly. Bang, 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 bang. 17 bullets rapidly shot out, leaving a circle mark on the glass door. However, the glass door did not shatter. After killing so many people and bleeding so much blood, he finally saw his target, that grizzled-haired and solemn-looking Senator Macklin. At this time, the senator was sitting on a chair in the safe house with a calm face. He looked at him outside the glass door, his eyes showing pity and ridicule. Chapter 299. Despite the distance in the universe and the obstacles of thousands of mountains and rivers, Sulu did not hesitate to kill his way over. In the end, at the last moment, he was blocked by a glass door that looked very thin and brittle. That last step. Heaven and earth could not block his eyes. The glass door in front of him was extremely clear, but it cast a layer of haze over his heart. The continuous shots left clear marks on the smooth glass door, but the glass door did not show any signs of shattering. He did not know what material it was made of, but it was so sturdy. Sulu and Macklin looked at each other calmly through the glass. This was the first time they had met in person, but the moment they saw each other, they were going to fight to the death. This was a safe house. In the official residences of the real political leaders of the Federation, they would often design such a place of last resort. However, most of the safe houses were mainly designed with high-strength alloys. Very few people would use transparent polymeric materials. Did this mean that the owner of this safe house had some kind of psychological abnormality? It was said that there was such a safe house in the White President's official residence in the Capital Special District. That safe house had an independent life support system and extremely strong defensive capabilities. It could directly resist the shots of battleships' main cannons outside the atmosphere, or nearby super-strong explosions. It could also ensure that the president, who was hiding in the safe house, could live alone and safely for 7 days. Senator Macklin's safe house inside the Foundation building should not be more powerful than that one. However, without powerful heavy firepower, an ordinary assassin would never be able to take a step forward. Sulu had just arrived in front of Councilman Macklin after crossing mountains, rivers, and corpses. Was she going to be stopped by this layer of glass? This was the first time he saw Macklin in reality, but at this time, he did not look at the old statesman's demeanor or the last scene behind the glass. He just glanced at him and walked to the side of the glass door, stabbing the bayonet into the wallpaper. With a click, Sulu pried open the safe house's assembly control system. His blood-stained hands started to move, quickly separating the data cable from the power cable in the box and then connecting them. He was so focused that he did not hear the gunshots that were getting louder and louder from behind the building. Macklin, who was behind the glass door, narrowed his eyes slowly. He did not know the killer outside, but he was very familiar with the young man's face. He was the nobody named Sulu. Although you are a genius engineer, don't expect to be able to open the safe house from the outside. His voice came out from the communication system in the corner of the safe house. His voice was slightly distorted. Okay, okay. 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 Sulu did not pay attention to what he was saying and continued to focus on his work. He had obtained enough information from Green Dragon Mountain in advance to enter the Golden Foundation building single-handedly. Naturally, he would not forget this safe house. Although the speed of his advance was much slower than he had planned, allowing Macklin to successfully hide, Sulu did not feel any despair or resentment in his heart. He had already made sufficient preparations. I've always been very curious about who would come to kill me, but I really did not expect that it would be you alone. Behind the glass door, Senator Macklin gently stroked a pen in his hand and sighed. He did not know how many life-and-death struggles he had experienced in his life, whether it was the expedition against the Empire, the internal purge of the anti-government forces in Green Dragon Mountain, or the guerrilla warfare in the mountains later. If it were not for some kind of providence protecting him, he believed that he would have died long ago. Sulu, who was outside the glass door, did not pay attention to him. He was still busy with his own work. Macklin narrowed his eyes as he watched this scene. He actually felt some appreciation for this extremely calm guy. Of course, it was more of a faint uneasiness and anger. Today, S1 was holding a presidential inauguration ceremony. As a politician without any family background, Macklin had spent most of his life taking a circuitous path in order to be able to ascend to the position of vice president. Yes, vice president. Because the vice president was also the chairman of the Federation Management Committee, only the Federation Management Committee could truly get close to the mysterious Bureau of Proclamation. Macklin narrowed his eyes. At this moment, he thought of many things that had happened many years ago. If he had not gone to Bermuda, perhaps he would still be a hot-blooded and upright veteran in the eyes of the Federation people. However, destiny was destiny after all, and this was something that no one could change. He did not think that he had failed. He believed that in the history of the universe, no one had been more successful than himself. Although he had not been able to ascend to the highest political throne in the Federation, after operating in the Federation for so many years, he had already obtained what that person had asked for his help to obtain many years ago. Macklin narrowed his eyes and looked at Sulu, who was silently busying himself outside the door. He knew that the other party could not come in at all. As long as the backup forces inside the building or the Federation government's army rushed over, he would definitely be safe. However, he did not feel too much joy at surviving because in the original plan, he was supposed to take advantage of the inauguration ceremony in the capital to go to the faraway West Woods to visit the frontline soldiers and then quietly disappear into the universe. All of this had been forcefully delayed by the small-eyed man outside the glass door. Thinking of this, a self-deprecating smile appeared on Macklin's lips. No one in the entire universe could really see through him. If it was the Federation who had discovered his secret, if it was the Bureau of Proclamation who had discovered his secret, perhaps he could accept it a little more. However, it was obvious that Sulu, who was outside the glass door, did not know anything. The mission that he had used his whole life to complete was going to be ruined by the stubbornness and impulsiveness of a young man who did not know anything. Macklin could not help but touch his white hair and sigh in his heart. Sulu, who was outside the door, seemed to have heard the sigh in his heart. He lowered his head and carried on with his work seriously. Suddenly, he opened his mouth and said, "There's something I've been wanting to ask you face to face." It was strange to say that the heroic and cold assassin, the scheming target, had a temporary peace because of the glass door. They could even have a conversation that was extremely difficult to imagine. Macklin looked at him with a smile. "Please ask." Sulu lowered his head and quickly answered. Without looking up, he asked, "You were the one behind the incident in Lin Hai and the concert, right?" Although countless evidence had already proven that Macklin was the cold-blooded and terrifying mastermind behind the scenes, Sulu still wanted to ask this person face to face. Yes. Macklin climbed up from the bottom. He was able to obtain the support of countless people in the Federation. He was able to walk the line between the government and the anti-government army. He was also able to obtain the help of countless higher-ups in the Federation. To be able to make someone like Zhang Xiaoming follow him to death, he must have a very outstanding side and his unique personality. Therefore, when Su Lu asked this question, Macklin smiled and gave an affirmative answer without thinking. Su Lu still lowered his head and asked, "Can you face your conscience?" Macklin, who was behind the glass door, after hearing this seemingly naive and childish sentence, became strangely silent. He thought of the factory and the companions he grew up in since he was a child. He thought of the comrades who bathed in blood with him. But then he thought of the indescribable loneliness and the lofty sense of mission in his heart all these years. He was surrounded by others. What an unbearable life this was. Conscience is when we realize the existence of the moral court in our hearts. Look at the planet under your feet. It's still rotating. Macklin's slightly inflected voice came from beside the glass door. What I do is in accordance with the moral court in my heart. Hearing this sentence, Su Lu did not say anything. He silently completed the connection of the safe house's assembly system. He raised his wrist and said softly to his watch, "Can you hear me?" Cracking the safe house's password required a powerful computing platform. In the plan, this task should have belonged to the high-level workbench at the mountaintop, and the person operating the workbench should have been Magnolia. Secretary Bai's soft but reassuring voice did not come through the earpiece. Su Li's heart gradually turned cold. During the later part of the assault, Magnolia at the mountaintop disappeared. He did not think that Secretary Bai had betrayed him at the most critical moment, because Magnolia had an excellent opportunity to do so. Su Lu was only worried that something might have happened to Magnolia at the mountaintop. Without the workbench to remotely decode the code, how could he open the safe house? Su Lu should have confirmed this before the connection. Otherwise, it would have been a waste of time. But strangely, he did not seem to have such knowledge. Instead, he directly reconnected to the assembly system. With a soft beep, the 8 hidden buttons on the glass door outside the safe house were all locked. It was harder to break than before. He dragged his injured leg back to the glass door, raised the pistol, and narrowed his eyes to aim at the circle left by the bullet on the glass door. He pulled the trigger again. His heart was a little heavy and anxious. He was very confident in the glass door in front of him. However, at this time, the reinforcements had yet to arrive. The people from the 2nd Military Region had yet to arrive, and the helicopters had yet to arrive. The spaceship in the distant spaceport was still waiting for him. Would he be able to board the spaceship that did not require a ticket today? His heart was also a little heavy and anxious. Who knew how many light years away, in the star sector outside the Federation, there was a person whose heart was heavier and more anxious than Su Lu and Macklin, who were on the brink of death. Lin Banshan, the top figure in the 2nd generation of the 7 major families in the Federation, the most famous rebel, and the one who could break the marriage alliance between the two families, was looking out of the glass window with a melancholy face. The glass window reflected his thin and cold face, which overlapped with the street view of the first administrative planet of Bermuda outside the window. It was somewhat unpredictable. The living environment of the Bermuda star sector was much more dangerous than that of the Federation. Even though it was the #1 administrative planet, the 4 seasons were much harsher. For example, it was late winter outside the window, and the temperature had dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. The smugglers who should have been wandering on the streets had no choice but to return to their lairs or spaceships. Lin Banshan should have been in South Kazhou at this time, eating meat and drinking with his most trusted right-hand man, Zhang Xiaohua, while watching the presidential inauguration ceremony with a smile. But as early as 10 days ago, he quietly left the Federation and came to Bermuda alone. He, who was evaluated by Lady Tai as a hero in troubled times, left his roots and subordinates so easily, and took the risk to secretly come here. Naturally, he had something important to do. Many years ago, he also came to the dangerous Bermuda alone like this and built his own empire in this chaotic land. In these 10 days, he was going to rely on the foundation he built back then to investigate the suspicious case from decades ago. Even Lin Banshan couldn't help but feel heavy and anxious when he thought of the suspicious case. He stood in front of the window, waiting for the results of the interrogation. His shoulders felt like they were cut by a knife, and he felt a little overwhelmed. He turned back and walked to his desk. The light screen that had not been turned off for a day and a night was constantly playing a video on loop. The video was obviously very old, and the picture quality was quite blurred. Bermuda was not like the Federation, which had the support of the glory of the Charter. It did not have the support of the huge database of the central computer. It had to be said that Lin Banshan was extraordinary to find this video from many years ago. Lin Banshan sat in a chair, squinting at the video, motionless. In the video, the respected old senator was just a young man who had just retired from the army. The two people who were talking to him, one was a young fat man, and the other had a delicate face, but gave a strange feeling, as if he was wearing a mask. A file appeared on the light screen. Lin Banshan pinched his tired eyebrows and opened the file. The file was the result of the analysis by a professional lip analysis expert. Lin Banshan looked at the dialogue in the file, and his eyes gradually narrowed. An extremely cold chill appeared in his eyes. Night Scorpion, Gary Corridor. Lin Banshan murmured and repeated the two nouns, confirming something. He suddenly got up, pushed open the bookcase behind him, walked into the secret room, and said coldly to the confidential secretary, "Connect to the Bureau of Proclamation." The confidential secretary nodded. While operating, he replied, "The synchronization will take 7 minutes. Don't worry about synchronization." Lin Banshan coldly scolded, "Now." Whether it was in the Federation's underground society, or traveling the universe, this most famous prodigal son of the Federation was always so calm when dealing with his subordinates and partners. Especially the people in this room, they had followed him for many years, but it was the first time they saw him so cautious. No one dared to say anything, and quickly started their work, connecting to the distant Federation Bureau of Proclamation. The door in the other corner of the secret room was pushed open, and a middle-aged man in black walked out, exuding a cold aura. The middle-aged man's face was pale, and he was wiping the blood on his hands with a handkerchief. Before the door closed automatically, a person could be vaguely seen hiding in the chair behind the door. That person was extremely fat, and his hair was white. Looking at his old face, it seemed to be similar to the fat man in the video that Lin Banshan had been paying attention to. However, at this time, this old fat man was covered in blood, and his hands hanging weakly by the chair looked like skinned willow branches. No one knew how many cruel punishments he had suffered. "He's confessed." The middle-aged man in black walked to Lin Banshan's side, and an unhealthy blush appeared on his pale face. "I don't know why an emperor would take the risk to come to Bermuda, and you should know that Macklin was just a small figure back then. But today, Macklin is a big figure." Lin Banshan lowered his head and said, "He has operated in the Federation and the anti-government army for so many years. I'm worried that the coordinates of the two space passages in the Night Scorpion Nebula and Gary Corridor, the things we want to protect, should still be in his hands. Within the Federation, he can't send these things away. All these years, he hasn't left the Federation even once." Lin Banshan raised his head and looked at the motionless light screen. He said firmly, full of murderous intent, "My suggestion is that we don't need evidence. Find Macklin and kill him. I'll remind you one last time, this matter has nothing to do with politics, it only has to do with the Federation," he said with a sullen face, then turned off the light screen and walked out of the office without looking back. "Get ready, we'll return to the Federation immediately," Lin Banshan said gloomily. As the top talent of the 7 major families in the Federation, he knew better than anyone the pedantic and dangerous politics of the Federation. He was very worried that Macklin, an enemy with full political wisdom, would use the historical inertia of the upper echelons of the Federation to find a gap that could be exploited. The reason why the old director with the surname Yun wanted to establish this special task force without the government's knowledge was because the target they were investigating, whether it was within the government or lower-level organizations, had an unimaginable number of partners and fanatical supporters. In order to keep it a secret, the Bureau of Proclamation's secret investigation was even hidden from the president's official residence and the Federation Management Committee. It was also because of the need for secrecy that the Bureau of Proclamation, which was usually only responsible for collecting information and never carried out specific tasks, showed a rare lack of fluster this time without the full support of the Federation Investigation Bureau. The office door was pushed open, and a member of the Special Task Force hurriedly walked in. He frantically flipped through the files in his hands and said, "The target has left S2 today and is heading to the front line of the West Woods to visit the army." "Going to the West Woods? I'm afraid he'll have to escape on the way." A chill rose in Cui Judong's heart. He waved his hand to signal for the staff member to leave. Then he picked up the phone in his hand and dialed a number. In front of the Parliament Hill in the capital's Special Administrative Region, President Pabre's 10-minute speech had not been long since the inauguration ceremony of the President of the Federation began. The guests and ordinary people on the stone steps carefully listened to every word with excitement and calmness. No one noticed that a strange atmosphere had already enveloped the viewing platform. The big shots in the upper echelons of the Federation seemed to be disturbed by a certain piece of news. Although they immediately calmed down, the deep eyes of those old faces flashed with a different light. The first big shot to know that the S2 Peace Foundation building was attacked was the director of the Federation Investigation Bureau. Within the Federation, this organization collected information the fastest. Just 2 minutes after the alarm sounded inside the Foundation building, the director of the Federation Investigation Bureau, who was standing in the second row of the viewing platform, heard the shocking news. At this time, he could not analyze who dared to do such a sensational and terrifying thing on the day of the inauguration ceremony. The director held the phone and occasionally looked up at President Pabre, who was giving a speech on the stage. He frowned slightly and forcibly suppressed the anger in his heart. In a low voice, he gave orders to his subordinates. Then, he quietly walked behind the National Security Advisor and whispered a few words. At this time, the National Security Advisor was looking at the president on the stone steps with a smile on his face. He hoped that President Pabre could see his sincere feelings. Although he was President Sieg's teacher, he still hoped to play a role in the new government. Suddenly, he heard a voice behind him. His face immediately became gloomy. He turned around and said a few words in a low voice. The actions of these two big shots immediately fell into the eyes of many people. The guests on the viewing platform could not help but speculate in their hearts. What had happened that made these two big shots want to talk about it, regardless of the fact that President Pabre was giving the most important speech? Then, the director of the Special Task Force, who had been silently standing behind the president on the stone steps, suddenly pressed the metal particles in his ear. His expression changed slightly. Then, he quietly took 2 steps back and whispered a few words. The guests on the viewing platform were undoubtedly the smartest and the most observant group of people in the Federation. When the director of the Special Task Force's strange look fell into their eyes and combined it with the scene they had noticed earlier, they were sure that something big must have happened. In an inconspicuous position in the second-to-last row of the viewing platform, Lady Tai, who was wearing a black windbreaker, slowly put down the phone in her hand. A trace of anger flashed in her usually calm eyes, which immediately turned cold. Then, Liyuan Palace and the heads of the 7 families of the Federation, who were quietly standing in the crowd, all learned of the violent assassination that was happening on S2 through their respective intelligence channels. The faces of all those who knew the inside story changed slightly. They might not know who the assassin was, and they did not care about the life or death of Senator Macklin. But they were concerned about the current situation in the Federation, which they had single-handedly controlled and created. But at this time, there were some disobedient insignificant people who tried to destroy everything they had agreed on. So, they were shocked and angry. On the stone steps, President Pabre's speech was still going on, but the strange atmosphere on the viewing platform was getting thicker and thicker. On the most important day of the Federation, because of an assassination that happened in the distance, it became a little strange. The National Security Advisor quietly walked up the stone steps and said a few words behind the Vice President-elect, then pointed at the back of President Pabre. The Vice President-elect anxiously shook his head. More people looked at the eye-catching position in the first row of the viewing platform. The incident happened suddenly, and they wanted to know how the old director of the Bureau of Proclamation of the Federation would react. Behind the oath-taking platform, President Pabre also noticed the strange expressions of his subordinates and guests. He narrowed his eyes and calmly continued his policy speech, but the corner of his eyes swept over the director of the Bureau of Proclamation. In the eyes of the crowd, the white-haired director looked down, as if he didn't know anything. In fact, he was very clear about the reason for the strange situation at the presidential inauguration ceremony. In fact, he was the first person in the capital city to know about the S2 assassination. At this moment, the phone in his pocket vibrated. He leaned on his walking stick and left the viewing platform in a senile manner. Accompanied by his subordinates, he walked toward the back of the platform. He did not seem to care about the gazes that fell on him at all. It was as though this was not a presidential inauguration ceremony, and President Pabre was not giving a speech. The old director held the phone and listened silently for a while, then slowly said, "How long has Sulu been in there?" 14 minutes, 27 seconds. On the other end of the phone, the assistant director gave an extremely accurate answer. "Well, it seems that we can't count on him anymore." The old director heard the answer, slightly lowered his eyes, and said, "You think he will escape?" "He was scheduled to leave S2 today, but the problem is that we don't know where the spaceship he prepared is." On the other end of the phone, Cui Zhedong said in a low voice, "And his identity is special. The Bureau doesn't have any evidence yet, so it's not convenient for us to directly issue orders." The old director was silent for a long time, then said, "The Bureau of Proclamation's words are the evidence." On the other end of the phone, Cui Zhedong didn't say anything, and just listened quietly. "Comb through all the aircraft that left S2 today. If Medellin really wants to leave," the old director's voice paused for a moment, "just shoot him down." After the phone call ended, the old director looked back at the Parliament Hill in the cold winter. His eyes slowly fell on the lady on the viewing platform, and then he frowned and looked at the so-called big shots on the platform. These big shots who liked to play politics only knew that Medellin was assassinated, but they didn't know what Medellin meant to the Federation. A hint of mockery flashed in the old director's eyes. To him, as long as the Bureau of Proclamation started paying attention, no one in the Federation could avoid the glory of the Constitution, and that was the same for Senator Medellin, who was well aware of the political shortcomings of the Federation. All the military officials and important figures were gathered in the capital of S1, and Medellin took advantage of the presidential inauguration ceremony to leave. He was really a smart guy to the bone. Without the military's orders, who dared to stop Medellin from leaving? If that person really went into the depths of the vast universe, who could stop Medellin's return? Director C sighed softly, shook his head, and walked toward the Federal Fleet Commander, 3-star General Hong Yuliang. If the Bureau of Proclamation wanted to forcibly seize the temporary command authority of the fleet and shoot down Medellin's spaceship, they would at least have to give this strong woman a heads up. Of course, Director C also knew very well that without a trial, the Bureau of Proclamation would have to pay a heavy price after killing a senator, a highly popular vice presidential candidate, and this price would most likely be his early retirement. However, he did not hesitate at all. The Emperor of the Empire had used that senator to toy with the Federation for so many years. As the director of the Bureau of Proclamation, he felt endless shame. If he could still let Medellin leave alive today, he might as well commit suicide. The Federation's 2nd Military Region, Oak State Garrison Headquarters. The Golden Foundation building is calling for the 3rd time, requesting emergency support. The enemy's attack speed is too fast, and they have a lot of firepower. A first lieutenant staff officer quickly ran behind the garrison commander and said with an unpleasant expression, "Commander, should we send a combat team over?" "Send my ass." The garrison commander did not pay attention to his subordinate's urgent request at all. His eyes were slightly red as he stared at the holographic map on the light screen. Looking at the clear heat traces on the map, looking at the flashing analysis numbers beside them, and then listening to the incredibly noisy voices of the staff officers on the other side, he vented all the emotions in his heart. He turned around and glared fiercely at the staff officer, saying, "The Green Dragon Mountain Army has been fully mobilized, and the entire military region is preparing for defense. You want me to send people to protect a bullshit senator at this time? Do you want me to go to military court?" The staff officer had nothing to say in response. In the early hours of this morning, the Green Dragon Mountain Anti-Government Army, which had not made any major military movements in the past few years, suddenly acted out of the norm and sent out 4 armies. Following the winding mountain paths in the mountains, they marched out of the mountains with an extremely threatening aura. Although the anti-government army's military movement had not yet broken through the actual control line of both sides, this kind of high-pressure situation made the federal army stationed around the 4 states feel an unprecedented pressure. Was the war really going to start? At this critical moment, the news of the Golden Foundation building being attacked was selectively forgotten by all the officers of the Federation's 2nd Military Region. There were priorities, and with the war imminent, who would pay attention to this kind of thing? For the people of the 2nd Military Region, it was better for an old wolf like Macklin, raised by the anti-government army, to die as soon as possible. The sudden attack of the anti-government army just happened to give them an excuse to feel at ease. It was because of the Green Dragon Mountain Anti-Government Army's sudden combat readiness that the 2nd Military Region, which was currently under a rain of bullets, had no intention of going to provide support even though it had been almost 20 minutes since the attack. What are these wolves in the mountains trying to do? The garrison commander stared coldly at the increasing number of red dots on the map. His heart was extremely cold. His immediate superior, the commander of the 2nd Military Region, was attending the presidential inauguration ceremony in the capital today, but at this time, the Green Dragon Mountain Anti-Government Army suddenly came out in full force. This situation was very suspicious. A huge explosion resounded in the mountains somewhere in the 4 states. This was not the front line of the battle between the government army and the anti-government army, but an abandoned factory that no one paid attention to. Reporting, mission successful. An anti-government army soldier wearing a camouflage uniform came to the forest and said to the middle-aged man wearing a straw hat in a deep voice. He smiled and patted the shoulder of the subordinate, then turned around to look at the place where the smoke rose. At this time, the comrades in the mountains should have already assumed a full-scale attack posture. Under such a high-pressure situation, the 2nd Military Region probably would not notice Macklin's movement. There was a temporary spaceship landing base in the abandoned factory. The escape route that Macklin had prepared should be here. He looked at the smoke and thought about how he met and fought with Macklin in this life. His heart became slightly cold. Although he was known as the most famous intelligence leader of the 37 constitutions, he was not an organization like the Federation's Bureau of Proclamation, so he did not know Macklin's true identity. He could not understand why Macklin was in such a hurry to leave. But since he had found this out, he made his own response. He and Macklin had fought for many years, and in the end, he did not know who won and who lost. But at least today, he cut off Macklin's support from the government, and cut off Macklin's escape route. He had done everything he could. On the mountaintop southwest of the Peace Foundation building, a black workbench was lonely among the fallen leaves. There were a few corpses around it, and blood flowed slowly along the red leaves. The delicate man who was supposed to be guarding the workbench and providing technical support to Sulu had disappeared without a trace. No one knew where he went. Inside the Peace Foundation building, many people had died, but some were still alive. The sound of bullets whistling through the air was intermittent, but it never stopped. The bullet marks and debris on the walls of the building fully proved how tragic the story had been from the beginning to the present. From time to time, there was a dull sound. Some walls were penetrated, and some were blown to pieces. Amidst the blood and smoke, the hearts of the security personnel in the building were about to freeze. They didn't know who the second intruder was. Although this person might not be as unpredictable as the previous one, the absolute professional military accomplishment and the terrible weapon in his hand were like a black wall of death, blocking in front of them. Shi Qinghai, who was covered in blood, was holding a 37 brand cigarette and an ACW as he stood guard in front of the last tunnel in the East 3rd District. There were shiny bullet shells in front of and behind him, as well as a suitcase that he carried with him. The ACW trembled violently, spewing gunfire. His lips, which were holding the cigarette, were a little pale and trembling. He did not know how long he could hold on. He could only clearly feel that his blood was flowing out of the bullet holes. There were more dense bullet marks on the glass door, but the high-hardness material did not show any signs of breaking. In the middle of the circle of bullet marks that was hit by Su Lu, there were 3 neat lines. It was like a circle with the big word, people, written in the middle. Senator Macklin, whose hair was messy, squinted his eyes and stared at Su Lu outside the glass door through the slight bullet marks. Until now, he still firmly believed that as long as he stayed in the safe house for a while, the forces loyal to him would come to his aid. Even if all the people loyal to him died, the Federation government would not just stand by and watch him die. The commotion caused by his death would cause the 2nd Military Region to come to his rescue. As long as he left the Peace Foundation building, he would be able to rush to the unknown base, take the spaceship and leave S2. During the long journey to the West Woods, he would quietly disappear from Bermuda and return to his hometown. This would be a long journey home. What awaited him would be unprecedented achievements and a warm welcome from his family. However, this councilman didn't expect that there were many people who didn't know his true identity, but still used all their strength to try to keep him here or kill him for some ridiculous reason. For example, Shi Qinghai, who was fighting a bloody battle outside the room, or Su Lu, who was outside the glass door. Even if he could leave the building, he could not leave S2. Even if he left S2, what awaited him would be the Bureau of Proclamation's ruthless authority and the gunfire from the space fleet. Of course, if it was not for Su Lu silently killing his way in today, perhaps before the Bureau of Proclamation could take action, Macklin would have already disappeared into the vast universe. The glass door did not shatter. Su Lu lowered his head, but he was not disappointed. He took out a nutrition bar and ate it in big bites. Then, he sat down in the open space in front of the glass door and closed his eyes as if he was about to fall asleep. Macklin narrowed his eyes as he watched his strange actions. A strong sense of uneasiness grew in his heart, but he did not know where this uneasiness came from. Suddenly, he understood. His uneasiness came from his opponent's calmness. The young man outside the door had always maintained an absolute calmness, and this calmness was rather frightening. Macklin gently turned the pen in his hand, his pupils constricting slightly. There was something very important hidden in the pen. It contained the specific data of the 2 channels of the Night Scorpion Nebula and the Gary Corridor, as well as an extremely fine chip. If it were not for the election failure, perhaps he would not have thought of going home. However, he had already obtained enough valuable information. He should be able to go home with confidence. At this moment, Macklin's homesickness overwhelmed his fear of the current situation. Macklin had previously told Su Lu through the door that although he was a genius engineer, he would not be able to open this security door. Su Lu, who was sitting on the ground, opened his eyes at this moment. He looked at the senator behind the door and said, "I'm very good at physics." As soon as he finished speaking, his body began to tremble violently. His face was pale, but his eyes were exceptionally bright. He took a step forward, roared, and transferred all the energy in his body to his right arm in an instant. Then, he punched out like lightning. There was no need for tools. Humans were the best machines. Su Lu only believed in his own fists. This punch happened to hit the point where the bullet marks converged, right in the middle of the character, human. With a muffled sound, it seemed as if the entire room began to tremble. Following the sound of paper tearing, a crack suddenly appeared on the extremely hard glass door that even bullets could not penetrate. Chapter 301. After following Professor Shin Yulin for many days, Su Li's theoretical physics was still his shortcoming. However, as an engineer with rich practical experience, his understanding and application of the non-elastic Hawk's law was not something an ordinary person could compare to. The connecting assembly system made the outer transparent material of the safe house sturdier. Bullets were used to forcibly draw a balanced line on the surface of the safe house. Finally, gravity was applied to the connecting part. Only then could one strike succeed. It was not difficult to have the theory and dare to put it into practice. The key was to have the means and ability to implement it and smash the evil safe house. The most important thing was Su Li's last punch. This punch was too fierce and too heavy. It was like a large steel ball hanging from a heavy dismantling machine, whizzing over. No matter how sturdy the design of the safe house was, it probably never occurred to them that a person's body could explode with the power of such a heavy machine. Therefore, in front of Su Li's fist, the transparent glass door cracked open. The white cracks spread out like a spider web. Then, it shattered into a messy postmodern image. In the end, it shattered into countless pieces of brittle glass and fell to the ground. It was like thousands of piles of snow piled up between the two of them. With such an inhuman strength, Su Li's right wrist snapped. His face was pale, but his squinted eyes were unusually bright. Without a trace of pain or hesitation, he walked into the door. His military boots stepped on the thousands of piles of broken glass and snow, making a rustling sound. Just as the glass door shattered, Senator Macklin's eyes, which were as calm as a lake, also shattered into pieces. The tranquil luster dimmed for a moment before dispersing in all directions. Because of the unimaginable abnormality in front of him and the approaching death, it disappeared from his old and tired black eyes. When a boy wooed the girl he liked by the Rose River, he would probably think of his peers in the movies. Those Casanova with big noses or small noses cheering for him. The young people who participated in the high school joint examination would definitely think of countless outstanding seniors or the best cheaters in the school to cheer for them. When the last soldier in the frontline tunnel in the West Woods held a cluster bomb and fearlessly charged at the dynasty's tanks in front of him, he would definitely think of many heroes, such as Li Pifu. Those who acted bravely for a just cause. Thinking back to those who acted bravely for a just cause in the past, those who did not care about their own safety, perhaps they did not have the time to think too much. People would habitually use a lot of mental things to boost their courage and confidence before doing something big. Su Lu was also an ordinary person, and he was no exception. However, when he stepped on the glass and came to the front of Senator Macklin, he did not think of anything. Su Lu did not expect Macklin to look like an old man with one foot in the grave. The look of despair on his face was like that of a person who deserved sympathy. He did not think about the consequences of killing Macklin. He did not think that it was a human life. Su Lu did not think about the consequences of killing Macklin. He had watched this person for a whole year. He was a little tired and wanted to give up. However, the pictures of the dead children in Charter Square made him pick up the idea again. Perhaps it was because he thought for too long on the bench behind the snow, so he did not think about anything today. He did not need to think. Carrying his travel bag, he killed his way into the heavily surrounded Golden Foundation building and killed his way to the old man. Some people thought too much and did too little. Su Lu would do it after he thought it through. He was just an ordinary person. At this time, he did not even know Macklin's true identity. What a small person like him did would have a great impact on the Federation. He raised the gun with his left hand and pulled the trigger. After entering the building, everything was going according to plan. However, there was a huge problem in the middle. But from the way Su Lu dealt with the matter of the safe house, under the premise that he had enough information. He was a very calm person who could come up with a plan. So, at this time, he was sure that there was still one bullet left in his gun, the last bullet. However, the shot did not go off. The tough guns in Team 7's armory finally had a problem for the first time, but it happened at the most critical moment. Su Lu mumbled something vaguely. Blood was flowing from the corner of his mouth. He threw the gun in his hand to the ground. At this moment, Macklin's slack eyes quickly closed and regained their luster. He had experienced too many moments of life and death in his life, but there was not a moment as shocking as when Su Lu pulled the trigger between his eyebrows. However, when this moment disappeared, the experienced and tough Macklin was ready to seize this last chance. He did not try to take out the gun in his pocket to shoot. This was because what had happened before made him very clear that the small-eyed man in front of him had an unparalleled and terrifying strength in these aspects. Macklin reached out the pen that he had been holding in his hand and handed it to Su Lu. He said in a hoarse voice, "I think you should need this very much." Until now, Macklin was still thinking about why this person called Su Lu wanted to kill him. If it was to avenge the girl called Zhang Xiaomeng, but Zhang Xiaomeng was not dead. His previously forgotten broken right wrist was also starting to feel waves of sharp pain. Su Lu moved his sore and stiff body with difficulty, leaned against the wall next to him, and slowly sat down. In the capital special district of Planet S1 far away, in front of the sea of people in front of the Parliament Hill, the people who participated in the presidential inauguration ceremony looked excitedly at the dark-faced president on the stone steps. President Pabre's speech had come to an end. The overwhelming words, the sonorous and powerful words, and the promises that were not too complicated but were exceptionally powerful, were like countless bells that struck the hearts of the citizens who had placed endless hope in the new Federation government. The guests on the viewing platform had smiles on their faces as they respectfully and courteously watched President Prabal, who was waving his arms. However, what they were thinking was completely different from what they were thinking about during the solemn inauguration ceremony. The old director of the Bureau of Proclamation slowly closed the phone in his hand. Thinking of the news he had just heard, a smile appeared on his aged lips. The smile was full of endless relief. Macklin was dead. It's good that he's dead. I'll have to write Macklin's words in the future. From the beginning of the design, it was to have Su Lu use the pen to kill Macklin, so he had to arrange for the last bullet to go wrong. The reason for this was that he felt that perhaps Macklin would not do anything personally, but he could use orders to frame people and harm many people. From the bottom of his heart, he was not an official of the pen, so it was more appropriate for him to die with the pen. That paragraph also wanted to explain that many things could be negotiated. Many people would think so, but Su Lu had never thought about this problem. He was more direct. I originally thought that I would have to wait until 9 o'clock to write this chapter. Fortunately, I was in a good mood. Although my body is quite weak, I wrote it much earlier. At this time, I went to eat and then put on more clothes to keep warm. Speaking of which, it's only October, but the temperature is lower than I've ever experienced in my life. It's still the old saying from a long time ago. China is too big, and the difference between the North and the South is too big. The Federation is also very big. Chapter 302. The glory of the Charter, which was spread all over the Federation, was naturally aware of Macklin's death. The news quickly spread from the Bureau of Proclamation to the site of the inauguration ceremony. The old director with the surname Yun was the first to confirm the news, only a few minutes after Su Lu pulled out the tip of his pen. It was a crime to harbor a treasure, but at least he was holding something valuable. This news was not good news. The old director softly told the person he needed to tell, and then the news began to spread among the high-ranking government officials on the viewing platform and the stone steps. Although the range of the news was limited to a very small number of people, their shocked expressions still gave many people some hints. At this time, the director of the Bureau of Proclamation was basically able to confirm the true identity of Macklin, so when he heard the news, his old heart was filled with endless relief. He stood on the viewing platform with a smile and maintained his silence. The other high-ranking government officials, however, did not know this at this time, so their expressions were the opposite of his, extremely ugly. With warm applause, whistles, and music in front of Parliament Hill, President Pabre ended his speech. He kindly and extremely politely thanked the old Chief Justice, Mr. Heing, and then waved to the people below the stone steps. He held his wife's hand, and accompanied by his aides and office officials, they walked to the resting area. On the way, Vice President Byron and the director of the Federation Investigation Bureau quickly whispered a few words in his ear. President Pabre's expression suddenly became serious, his dark face hiding a trace of deep anger. He pondered for a moment, and then quickened his pace. The inauguration ceremony was still going on, and there should be several performances to set the atmosphere. The top cultural figures from the various regions of the Federation would work hard to show their best side, so the sea of people did not disperse, but waited excitedly. They did not know that the Federation had a big event today, and no one noticed the president's quick pace in the shadow of the winter tree. The guests on the viewing platform gradually dispersed. The high-ranking officials and generals of the government and military were all heading towards the president's residence not far away to participate in the first Federation government meeting. At this time, they roughly knew what had happened in the 4 states around S2, and their expressions couldn't help but be somewhat worried. The president of the Three Forest Federation Bank, old Mr. Li Yuan Gong, walked down with the help of his son. The short man adjusted the black round hat on his head, squinted his eyes, and looked back at Lady Tai. He found that the lady had already left. He couldn't help but sigh softly. Macklin is dead. We don't know who did it yet, but there should be news soon. Get ready. In the cold weather, the old man from Liyuan Palace coughed twice. The wrinkles on his face were as deep as knives. He looked at his successor and said, I think the president must be very angry. On the first day he came to power, he received such bad news. Li Xiuzhu, wearing a short gray windbreaker and a bow tie, looked very energetic. Although he had already guessed before, he had never thought that he would hear the news of Macklin's death today. His beautiful eyebrows instantly furrowed. He lowered his voice and said in a hurried tone, Father, what should we do? The Federation government will naturally do what they should do. Liyuan Palace took off his thick gloves and walked out along the special passage for the distinguished guests. What we need to do is to fully cooperate. Fully cooperate? Cooperate with what? Suppress the commotion that may soon arise because of Macklin's death. Li Xiuzhu's furrowed brows still couldn't loosen. Thinking of the politician who had just died, the old man from Liyuan Palace couldn't help but sigh softly. White mist scattered around his dry lips. The Federation can't be in chaos. I think both President Pabre and his wife will realize this. The old man said, since he's already dead, we have to accept this reality and do a good job of cooperating. This sentence was said very indifferently. The death of Macklin, who had been secretly cooperating with the Li family for a long time, was like a stranger in this old man's words. Last time, he was just caught and sent to the Justice Department, and this is already happening. I'm very worried. Li Xiuzhu said worriedly. Behind him, for some reason, there was a burst of enthusiastic cheers in the square. The old man from Liyuan Palace walked forward with a smile and said slowly in an old voice, I never look down on any ordinary people, but I also never overestimate their loyalty to their beliefs. Li Xiuzhu's heart trembled slightly. He vaguely understood something. Last time, Macklin's fanatical supporters had caused such a big commotion in the Federation. It seemed that his family was behind it. However, at that time, the Li family needed Macklin's ability to incite people to ensure that the Federation's investigation wouldn't go too deep and involve them. Now that Macklin was dead, the Li family naturally didn't have to worry about anything. They naturally had to stand firmly on the side of the government, or rather, on the side of the people. A few black cars without obvious markings were walking on the side road. The winter trees had no leaves, and the sun was clear and cold. Because of the traffic control of the presidential inauguration, these few cars were particularly eye-catching. Lady Tai sat in the back and looked at the street through the window. For the upper class of the Federation, this appearance on the viewing platform today was a rare opportunity to get close to her. Although she deliberately stood in the most inconspicuous corner, after the ceremony was over, who knew how many high officials and nobles tried to say a few words to her. However, this lady didn't have any desire to talk today. She looked at the withered trees with a heavy heart. Different from the wise old man from the Lee family, she already knew who the mastermind behind the assassination at the S2 Foundation building was. The interior of the car was as warm as spring. The madam quietly looked at the winter scenery, but she suddenly thought of the editor and reporter from the Capital Daily News. She thought of the inspector who was still locked up in the FBI but refused to back down. She thought of the crazy and dangerous people in Green Dragon Mountain. She thought of the man from many years ago. Naturally, she also thought of Sulu. She felt a little cold. The young man she wanted to control was indeed an extremely dangerous person, just like his teacher. Since that was the case, then he couldn't be left alive. Medellin is dead. Lady Tai retracted her gaze from the window and calmly said, "His Excellency the President may have some problems. Let the TV station and the network headquarters cooperate with the government." Secretary Shenli, who was sitting in the front passenger seat, slightly stiffened, then immediately reacted and calmly replied. At this moment, a bell rang in the capital special district. The clear and distant sound of the bell passed through a few blocks and was then filtered by the thick glass of the black car, becoming somewhat dull and deep. President Pabre's motorcade had already arrived at the president's official residence. The former president, Mr. Sieg, was waiting for them on the lawn. The highest authority of the Federation had begun to be handed over. According to the historical custom of the Federation, the bell next to Charter Square began to ring. Lady Tai listened to the bell with a calm expression, but in her heart, she was thinking, who is this bell ringing for? Sulu leaned against the wall, his face pale. His fractured right wrist hung over his knee, and the ground around him was a mess. Today, he had used all of his energy and squeezed out every drop of strength in his body. With the help of that great existence, he was so lucky, or perhaps crazy, to achieve his goal. The moment he fell, all of his injuries and exhaustion exploded, causing him to sit on the ground. He was so weak that he couldn't even lift a finger. The gunshot wounds on his body were very serious, but what really drained him was the final blow. A year ago in the underground parking lot of Linhai Stadium, he had valiantly kicked a military mecha, causing him to vomit blood and fall to the ground from the recoil. Today, he was much stronger than he was then, so he could still hold on, but he couldn't continue with the rest of the plan. Listening to the increasingly sparse gunshots outside the room and the scattered footsteps that gradually approached the door, Sulu lowered his head, speechless. The door was knocked open, and a person covered in blood rushed in. The first thing this person did after coming in was not to shoot at Sulu, but to push all of the furniture around the door behind the door, including two extremely heavy safes. Sulu raised his head, and with just one glance, his eyes lit up. When he knew that there was someone supporting him outside, he had been guessing who that person was. Now, he found that it was indeed him. Shi Qinghai, whose face was covered in blood, turned around and saw Macklin's body on the ground. He was slightly stunned. At this moment, his feet seemed to be filled with lead, showing his true condition. He laughed bitterly, walked to the wall with difficulty, and slid down weakly against the wall to sit beside Sulu. Sulu spat out a mouthful of blood, but it was spat on his clothes. He turned his head with difficulty, looked at this guy, and said in a hoarse voice, "I was hoping that you could get me out." Police sirens sounded around the Golden Foundation building. The police had rushed over. The Federation Investigation Bureau and more powerful departments had finally arrived. Even if all the security personnel inside the Golden Foundation building were killed by the two of them, it would be harder than climbing to the sky to escape now. I was hoping that you could get me out. Shi Qinghai lowered his head and scolded with a smile. His chest was heaving up and down. He had already thrown the ACW outside because he had run out of bullets. After blocking for Su Lu in the building for so long, his body was already full of scars. It had to be said that this fierce person, who was trained by the 1st Military Academy and the Green Dragon Mountain Anti-Government Federation, was extremely capable and lucky to be able to survive until now. Su Li's plan did have a final escape plan, but at this time, the two people sitting against the wall had already used up all their energy in the previous brilliant battle. They didn't leave any power or escape route for themselves, so they didn't have the ability to carry out the final plan. Of course, if they hadn't put in so much effort and fought so valiantly before, they wouldn't have been able to do it in front of such a tight defense. Su Lu looked down at the bracelet on his wrist, laughed bitterly, and coughed violently, coughing up 2 puddles of blood. The two people looked up at each other, shook their heads at the same time, and smiled in relief. At this time, there were countless fully armed combatants inside and outside the building. Not far away, the roar of armed helicopters could be faintly heard. The police headquarters and the investigators of the Federation Investigation Bureau had already confirmed the life and death of Councilman Macklin from the Bureau of Proclamation, so they didn't choose to attack immediately. Instead, they waited outside the building, trying to find a way to be as safe as possible. Of course you have to use a sniper for an assassination. You brat, you only knew how to kill your way in, and now I'm going to die with you. Tell me, how are you going to compensate me? Shi Qinghai said as he coughed. His handsome face was full of blood, and there was a terrible wound on his left cheek, looking extremely hideous. Su Lu glanced at him and smiled with difficulty. At this time, he was probably sure that there was a problem with Magnolia. He was killed by that guy, and Mr. Shi was killed by him. Since I've killed you, then I'll compensate you with a son. Su Lu lowered his head and wiped the blood on his lips. He smiled and said, "You probably don't know, but Zhou Yu gave birth to a son for you. His name is Zhou Youhua, and he has no physical defects." As soon as he said this, Shi Qinghai suddenly fell into silence. He narrowed his eyes and looked at Su Lu for a long time before he confirmed that this guy was not lying to comfort him before he died. His heart suddenly beat faster, and there was a touch of gentleness and shyness in his excitement. Really? Not really. Shi Qinghai was silent for a long time, and then said, "Unfortunately, I didn't know." Suddenly, he smiled and laughed. "But this shows that I'm really fierce. I can actually kill them with one shot." Su Lu wanted to laugh, but he couldn't. He kept coughing. Shi Qinghai narrowed his eyes and thought for a while. Then he took out a pack of 37 brand cigarettes with trembling hands and lit them up with trembling hands. He didn't have the calm and steady feeling he had when he was killing people in all directions. He took 2 deep breaths and then passed one over with trembling hands. He found that Su Lu didn't take it. Then he noticed that Su Li's right wrist was twisted, and there were several wounds on his left arm that were bleeding. Shi Qinghai shook his head and put a cigarette between Su Li's bloody lips. "You really shouldn't have come," he said. Su Lu held the cigarette in his mouth and said vaguely, "I wanted to come, so I came." The ashes of the cigarette fell and mixed with the blood on his chest. Shi Qinghai narrowed his eyes and looked around the office. He noticed that there was a painting hanging on the wall. It was a freehand painting of a splash ink lotus, and the style was dripping and fierce. He couldn't help but be puzzled. He murmured, "That guy Macklin, where did he get so much righteousness from?" Su Lu raised his head with difficulty, and squinted his eyes to take a look. He thought about what Macklin had said behind the door about conscience, and was puzzled by it. Only then did he remember that the pen he had used to kill Macklin was still tightly held in his left hand. He loosened his fingers and let the blood-stained pen slide to the ground. He said, "I used this pen to kill him. I thought that if you could escape, I would leave it, as a souvenir for you. Don't think of anything good." Shi Qinghai reached out and grabbed the pen with difficulty. He looked at it curiously and suddenly said, "I don't know if the government will allow me to leave this pen to my son as an inheritance." "Don't think of anything good," Su Lu answered weakly with his head down and the cigarette in his mouth. "Zhou Yu didn't find another man, did she?" "No, I kept an eye on her for you. Why do I feel a little guilty?" "I found another woman. But I didn't know, so it's not wrong, right?" "Hey, when did you become so close to her?" "I don't think I know her that well." "Oh, this is another long story." The inside and outside of the foundation building was heavily guarded. Blood and bullet marks filled the building. Countless fully armed combatants were holding guns and occupying all the passages. They surrounded the room. Maybe in the next moment, they would rush in and kill the two powerful terrorists. What surprised him was the behavior of the two terrorists against the wall at this time. Facing the countless gun barrels, Shi Qinghai, who was already exhausted, quickly raised his hands in the air. He was tearing up because of the smoke, and his eyes were red as he said seriously, "I surrender." At this time, he was holding a cigarette that was almost burnt out in his right hand and a bloody pen in his right. This posture looked very funny. Also, this guy beside me doesn't want to raise his hands and surrender. Shi Qinghai looked at the nervous and solemn special forces of the Federation in front of him and said seriously and sincerely, "Both of his hands are disabled. He really can't raise them." Su Lu, who had been keeping his head down, finally couldn't help but laugh out loud. The cigarette in his mouth spat out and fell to the ground, splashing a few sparks. Chapter 303. The Emperor never disappeared. He just changed his clothes a few times. George Carlin. In the late spring of the 68th year of the constitutional era, there were many buildings hidden in the lush forest at the northern end of S1 Nank State. In the early morning, loud slogans and uniform footsteps could be faintly heard coming from the field behind the mountain. Sometimes, the muffled sound of gunfire could be heard coming from the ground. This was originally a branch of the General Assembly base under the Ministry of National Defense of the Federation. 70 years ago, it was transformed into a military training base. During the war between the Federation and the Empire, there were countless brilliant military heroes who had received rigorous training here. The largest joint anti-terrorism battle exercise of the year had just concluded at this training base last week. At the end of the competition between the four military regions, there might not be a real winner, but the senior generals of the military were very pleased that they had picked out the best of the best from the soldiers who participated in the maneuver. For them, these young soldiers who performed well in the exercise were the most powerful reserve force of the federal military. Therefore, after the exercise ended, these officers who were listed by the Ministry of National Defense did not return to their original units. Instead, they stayed at the training base. In the depths of the base, there was a building covered with ivy. It looked extremely inconspicuous. The conference room on the third floor was dark. One could faintly hear the sound of heavy breathing and smelled the faint smell of men's sweat, but nothing could be seen. The only light came from the hologram in front of the conference room. It seemed that many people were watching a movie, but no matter how much the Federation soldiers paid attention to discipline, they would not be so silent when watching a movie. In the dark conference room, other than the smell of breathing and sweat, there was no sense of a person's presence. The light on the hologram passed through the smoke that filled the conference room and slowly dispersed. What was playing now was indeed not a movie, but a surveillance video marked as top secret. The video was a bit blurry, and the time stamp in the lower right corner showed that the video had taken place about 5 months ago, in the cold winter of January. In the video, there was a guy wearing a guard's uniform, wearing a hat and dragging a travel bag, walking inside a building. Because this person had his head down, his face was hidden under the shadow of the hat, so no one could see his true appearance. On the surveillance video, the sound of an alarm rang out. Under the command of the system, countless guards surrounded the intruder from all directions. From that moment on, the intruder in the guard uniform sped up. His body on the screen dazzled the audience in the dark. The intruder held 2 light machine guns and began to open fire. He began to run. His figure became a little strange and terrifying. He appeared and disappeared in every corner of the building. He calmly and terrifyingly killed the enemies one by one and hid himself. Then, he was ambushed by heavy fire behind a wall. Dust rose under his feet, and his body instantly rushed to the ceiling. Then, he pounced down and strangely avoided the bullets that filled the sky. He killed his way to the center of the enemy. The hologram in the conference room was divided into several screens. The surveillance system recorded the intruder's movements from different angles. At the same time, it monitored the movements outside the building. From time to time, there was the dull sound of a heavy sniper rifle. It seemed that someone was sniping outside the building. Every time there was a sound, a guard would fall to the ground. The people in the conference room who were watching the surveillance video maintained a dead silence. Except for the sound of breathing and the occasional sound of smoking, there was dead silence. The screen was filled with smoke. The intruder was obviously forced into a desperate situation. But for some reason, he stood up coldly and fearlessly. Under the cover of the smoke, he quietly walked toward the direction marked as the exit of the 3 eastern areas. The silent pistol in his hand seemed to be guided by God. Through the heavy smoke, he aimed at the enemy in the corner and gently pulled the trigger. At this point, the silent conference room finally had some more sounds. The sound of chairs moving could be heard. Perhaps the people who were watching the video could no longer control the shock in their hearts. As the surveillance video played, the auxiliary holographic screen on the side continued to explain the breakdown of the tactical actions. Data indicators flowed like a waterfall. The route of the invaders, the trajectory analysis during shooting, the time spent in each section, and the cooperation between the installation of the bomb and the acquisition of intelligence were all dissected. It was extremely naked. The surveillance video on the hologram finished playing. The lights in the conference room were turned on. There was still not much noise in the spacious conference room. Some of the officers in dark green military uniforms with different stripes on their shoulders were still squinting their eyes as they looked at the hologram. It seemed that they couldn't understand what they had just seen. More officers began to reach for their pockets, took out cigarettes, lit them, and stuffed them into their dry lips. For a time, the smoke in the conference room was thicker than before. It was extremely suffocating. These ace soldiers from the major military regions of the Federation smoked in silence. While thinking about the purpose of the training base to let them watch this video, they couldn't help but doubt the authenticity of the previous video. In the surveillance video, although the tactical movements of the ordinary-looking young man in the guard uniform did not appear to be very professional, the choice of every attack he made was so clean and efficient. Coupled with this person's inconceivably powerful actions, these attacks were extremely sharp and powerful, making the people who watched this video feel a deep sense of awe. There was also the sniper who rushed into the building later. He was also an extremely fierce person. Although not all the officers who watched the video recognized that the heavy big gun was the legendary ACW, the weight of the gun indicated on the auxiliary screen made them admire this slender guy who was able to carry a heavy anti-material rifle weighing 21 kilograms and climb walls and drill holes. Not to mention this person who guarded the entrance of the 3 eastern areas in the end. He actually used the anti-material rifle as a heavy machine to block the firepower. If the previous sniping outside the building showed that this sniper was absolutely excellent in military training, then this person later relied on the anti-material rifle to block the 3 entrances. It could only be said that this person played with guns to the point of ecstasy. This person was admirable, but what about that person? He actually calmly walked forward in the smoke like he was playing a game. He raised his hand and killed a person. Not to mention that he didn't have a thermal imaging system. Even if he did, it was impossible to perform this kind of movie scene in the environment created by the military smoke bomb. This was not something that a human could do. Therefore, some officers began to doubt the authenticity of this video. A female captain walked up to the podium in the conference room. She frowned and glanced at the officers who were smoking silently below the podium. She waved her hand in front of her, as if she wanted to drive away all the choking smoke. Although she was not in a good mood, in front of the treasures of the major military regions and the echelon officers who were focused on training by the federal military, she couldn't lose her temper. She had to lower her head and began to follow the instructions given by the superior. Her slender fingers lightly touched the terminal, and some pictures appeared on the hologram. The pictures were some pictures of some corpses and some damage on the wall after the force was applied. The female officer used the cursor to point at some of the bloody parts in the pictures and said in a clear voice, the first victim's throat was completely broken under the heavy blow. The second victim's forehead was hit hard, his skull was broken, and his blood vessels burst. According to the post-mortem, the strength of this person's right fist reached. The hardest part of the human body was the skull. How much strength would it take to break a human skull and break the blood vessels inside with one punch? The officers in the conference room, who had just shaken off their shock and were about to discuss a few words with each other, couldn't help but be shocked when they heard the value reported by the female captain. They sat up straight and looked at the hologram with a serious expression. This is the third victim. You can look at the data analysis. When he fired the gun, he still maintained an instantaneous speed of 11 meters per second without slowing down. You can also think that he didn't aim, but in fact, according to the report of the laboratory of the first hospital, this person's instantaneous reaction speed value has already broken through. The female captain finished the data analysis report and walked down the podium. The soldiers from all over the Federation squinted their eyes, and the cigarettes in their hands burned more and more brightly. However, of the two people in the video, one was a monster who could fight to a draw with Mad Manly, and the other was an awesome person who graduated first from the 1st Military Academy and was trained by both the Federation government and the anti-government army. This kind of comparison was undoubtedly unfair. The Department of National Defense probably didn't want them to watch this video just to wake them up. However, the officers who did not know the inside story of the surveillance video did not think so. They frowned and thought about the general's angry words. In the end, they had to admit that when facing the two terrorists in the video, if there were more people, there might be some hope. If the number of people was equal or close, then there was no hope at all. Some of you are from the West Woods, some of you are from the 3 military regions, and some of you are precious soldiers from the fleet. Usually, in your respective units, the officers protect you like treasures, but on the real battlefield, you can't be as fragile as treasures. The commander of the training base looked coldly at the officers below the stage. Looking at the most important echelon strength of the federal military in the future, he shouted loudly, "The ministry has kept you here so that you can grow into the most powerful soldiers." This week's learning task is to analyze this video, write a plan based on the 5-person team, and then hand it over to the terminal computer for evaluation. The Major General lowered his head and tidied up the files, using the corner of his eyes to pay attention to the reactions of the officers below the stage. The officers were stunned at first, but then their expressions turned fierce and unconvinced, which was not unexpected. He lowered his head, and the corner of his mouth rose with a trace of an indescribable smile. He thought in his heart, if the data of that guy called Sulu shattering the security door with his last punch was also recorded, would these guys still be able to maintain their last bit of confidence? The Major General turned and left the conference room. The officers who were usually arrogant and had a threatening aura flowing from their bodies still stayed in the room. Earlier, the Major General had made it clear that discussions could only be held within the confines of the conference room. As soldiers, they consciously followed the rules when it came to the top secrets of the Federation. The sound of discussion gradually rose, and the focus of the discussion was naturally on the surveillance video. These outstanding officers of the Federation did not know where the two people in the surveillance video who were defined as terrorists came from. They were only shocked by the powerful combat strength displayed by the other party in the video, as well as the mutual trust the two people showed in the almost desperate environment inside the building. This kind of person was undoubtedly the scariest as an enemy, but if they had such a fierce character among their comrades, how fortunate would that be? Zhou Yu, let's form a team. Although it's only a virtual battle, it's really a bit difficult to rely on 5 people to deal with the 2 people in the video. If it weren't for you, I really wouldn't have any confidence. An officer from the Special Mecha Battalion of the West Woods Military District walked to the back row with a smile. He lightly patted the gentle officer, lowered his head, and said with a light laugh, "Before we came, Zhou Jin said that he wanted you to take care of me." Half a year ago, Zhou Yu had finished his all-rounder program in the Nutshell Engineering Department and officially returned to the army. After graduating with high marks from the 1st Military Academy, he was now a member of the 1st Military District. Zhou Yu looked at the proud fellow in the middle of the seats, and could not help but look at him with pity. If this fellow knew that the person he did not think highly of could operate a mecha to defeat that crazy Lees of Philadelphia, would he still rely on his identity as a Special Forces mecha pilot to express his disdain for that video? Capital Special District, Linyuan. Zhou Yu did not choose to sit in the bamboo house today. Although she really liked the flowing water there, the floating leaves on the water, the white mountain night lights outside the window, and she also really liked the atmosphere when she and Su Lu used to sit in the bamboo house and chat, the matter she wanted to discuss today was very important, so she chose the safest private room in Linyuan. It was probably only in a place like Linyuan, under the eyes of people like Lin Banshan, that she did not have to worry that the matter she wanted to discuss today would be overheard by the Federation government, the military, or that madam she had always respected. You know that my life at home isn't that good right now. I'm not an elder brother, and I don't have a real job. After my dividends are put into the fund every year, the amount of money I can control on my own is not more than 10 million. Beside the table, the man wearing an expensive jacket had a gloomy expression on his face. In the past, this gloomy expression had long been replaced by the mental and physical exhaustion of the past few months. Zhou Yu looked at the 2 green arowana swimming slowly in the fish tank. Her figure had recovered very quickly after giving birth, and today, she wore a bright red gown. It was not tacky at all. Instead, because of the trace of coldness between her brows, it made her look exceptionally elegant. The second successor of the Li family. Even if you are about to be stripped of your right to inherit the family, I think that you still have something in your hands these past few years. She turned around, looked coldly at Li Xiaotong, and said, "You've already invested 500,000 in him. If he dies just like this, or is forever locked up in that place where no one knows, then this greatest investment of your life will forever be a failure. Since that's the case, why don't you take a gamble? You should know better than me what level of game this is. This is not a place where money can be used, unless the important figures at that level have their own ideas." Li Xiaotong looked at the delicious food on the table, but he didn't have the heart to raise his chopsticks. In a low voice, he said, "Although your father is already sitting in the position of Minister of Defense, the strength of your words in front of the madam is getting smaller and smaller." Zhou Yu sat back in her seat and lowered her eyelids slightly. A chill flashed across her beautiful face. "I know that the higher-ups have already begun to move, which is why I asked for your help. The day before yesterday, a video was played at the training base. I keep feeling that this means that some of the big shots in the military want to test something." Chapter 304. It had been nearly 5 months since the attack on the 4 prefectures Peace Foundation in January. In the past 100 days, the Federation government's investigation of this vicious terrorist incident seemed to have walked into a swamp of death that no one knew about. No matter how unstable the public's atmosphere was because of this incident, and the atmosphere of social stability had already fallen, the government's investigation had always been strictly controlled within a very small area, and the confidentiality measures were done extremely well. Until today, most people in the Federation still did not know what happened in the Foundation building that day, how Senator Macklin died, and who the murderer was. All the information was hidden behind a black curtain, which made the Zhou family's eldest daughter, who looked cold and arrogant, but was actually sensitive and delicate, smell something strange. The black curtain could often represent two completely different directions. The government suppressed everything, perhaps to hide something, and let the two men involved die quietly, never to speak again. But it could also be to protect the two men. Hearing Zhou Yu's words, Li Xiaotong was shocked. He raised his head and looked at her quietly. There was a hint of anxiety and warning in his usually cold eyes. He used to like the woman in red in front of him, and he could forget about it with a wave of his sleeve, but he still cared about her after all. Li Xiaotong had a military identity. Although he rarely wore the military uniform and rarely went to work in the 1st Military Region, he knew very well how strict the federal military's disciplinary measures were. The teaching content of the Department of Defense's training base had always been confidential. Moreover, if it really involved the surveillance video of that day, it was not something that ordinary people could know about, even if she was the daughter of the Minister of Defense. Your father shouldn't make this kind of mistake. He paused for a moment, lowered his head, and raised the chopsticks in his hand for the first time. He picked up 2 slices of white magnolia and put them in front of him, but did not put them into his mouth. I have my own information channel. Zhou Yu looked at him with a smile and said, if there is momentum, I have to be prepared in advance, so I need your financial support. I know that you have had a hard time in the past 6 months at home, but as I said before, your investment can only appreciate if Su Lu is alive. You should know that if Su Lu can survive, he has the potential to appreciate and the room for development. You want to be the head of the Li family? If you don't take some big risks, how can you reap great benefits? You're not a very good lobbyist. You probably haven't done this kind of thing before. Li Xiaotong replied calmly, not paying attention to Zhou Yu's expression that was gradually turning cold. He tapped his chopsticks lightly and said, when I invested in Su Lu, it was because I thought that he could be like the owner of this garden and have the ability to break certain rules, because my life will not follow rules. But I never expected that Su Lu would break the rules so badly. Not many people in the Federation could tolerate the things he did. A faint trace of sadness flashed in Li Xiaotong's eyes. He let out a self-deprecating smile and softly said, his first equipment and the workbench he threw outside the Foundation's building were all bought with my money. 4 months ago, the government had already found out about me. Yes, the elders at home definitely wanted to protect me, but my investment caused such a big trouble. My life in the past 6 months at home wasn't very hard like you said, but it was almost impossible. He waved his hand to signal Zhou Yu not to speak. His fingers left the chopsticks and placed on his knees. He lowered his head and thought for a long time in silence. I still insist that even if the upper echelons of the government have some new ideas, money won't play any role in this matter. But if you insist, I'll give you a sum of money when you need it. After breaking the silence, Li Xiaotong gently patted his knees and answered with a smile. He looked at Zhou Yu and said, you're confused because you care. You're in a mess right now. You should be very clear that no matter how hard people like us try, it's impossible to rescue him from that small dark house where we don't know the specific location. You should go find that crown prince now. According to my information, he has already returned to the back of Macho Mountain 2 months ago. Zhou Yu sat on a cushion at the table and looked out of the window at the forest that had nothing. She didn't answer Li Xiaotong's words. A trace of fatigue and helplessness flashed across her calm and beautiful face. At this moment, she thought of a lot of things, so much so that she didn't notice when Li Xiaotong left. She knew that Tai Ziyuan had already returned to S1, but in the past year, her relationship with Lady Tai had become more and more distant, and her crown prince brother could no longer be contacted. I don't know where you two idiots are locked up. A trace of deep anger flashed through the corners of her eyes. The two guys who were secretly locked up by the Federation probably didn't know how much trouble they had caused for the Federation in the past few months, and how much she had worried about them. After Li Xiaotong left, Zhou Yu remained in the quiet room. She held the small wine cup between her fingers, raised it up and down her wrist, and drank one cup after another. After a while, a blush gradually appeared on her cheeks, adding to her beauty. It completely set off a woman who was exuding a different kind of charm. After an indeterminate amount of time, the door was gently pushed open. A tall and thin man walked in and sat in front of her very naturally. He then poured himself a cup of wine and held it in his hands, slowly sipping. His posture was calm and unruffled, revealing the magnanimity of someone who was in control of everything. From the moment he entered the room to the moment he sat in the chair, this outstanding man around 30 years old acted like a master returning to his own home. Of course, Lin Yuan was originally owned by him. Zhou Yu slowly raised her head, put down the wine cup in her hand, and looked at the legendary figure in front of her that was collectively admired by the children of the aristocratic families. She smiled slightly and said, "I've told you about this matter last time. What do you think?" Lin Banshan looked at the girl. It was extremely rare for the children of the aristocratic families to be pregnant out of wedlock. Although the Zhou family was a newly established family, the daughter of the Minister of Defense was not the slightest bit affected by what had happened to her in the past year. It was rare to see her traveling and socializing so naturally. "I've seen Su Lu on the train. He's a very good young man," he said with a smile. "However, in my memory of the Federation, the daughter of the Zhou family was the daughter of the Zhou family. The daughter of the Zhou family is a cold-blooded woman who can order her subordinates to kill at any time. Is it because of her pregnancy that she has become so soft-hearted?" Zhou Yu smiled slightly and said to herself, "Regarding the matter of Su Lu, I've never been able to touch the truth, but the president's official residence and Parliament Hill seem to have different views, so I don't really understand. I'm just a reckless person." Lin Banshan slowly sipped the wine in his cup with a hint of appreciation. He looked at Zhou Yu and said, "The major matters related to politics are not something that people like me can speculate and probe. Of course, I've always thought that those things are very dirty, dirtier than the level we're in, so I'm not willing to get involved." Zhou Yu was actually a little nervous at this time. Although she had attended the tea party with Lady Tai and had seen many powerful people in the Federation, she was no stranger to the children of the 7 families of the Federation. But today, facing the most famous traitor of the Federation, the most famous unruly person in this circle, she always felt a little uneasy, but she hid this uneasiness very well. She stabilized her breath and said with a smile, "But as far as I know, the matter of the foundation building seems to have something to do with you. I don't know the details, but if they really did contribute to the Federation, don't you think they shouldn't be locked up for life?" Lin Banshan looked at her calmly. He had experienced a lot of ups and downs in his life. Although he had been nervous for a few months because of the Macklin incident, once it was over, his state of mind returned to the calmness of mountains and rivers. But the sudden words of the daughter of the Zhou family made his eyes suddenly have a little more interest. "I'm not the 7th young master. I know that it's impossible for your information channels to know these things, at least it's impossible for you to know that this matter has something to do with me." Lin Banshan slowly stood up. "If it's Minister Zhou's intention, you don't have to beat around the bush so much. I'll do what I need to do, but the Federation doesn't have a unified opinion, and it's not very appropriate to ask me, an outsider, to do something." Zhou Yu could only remain silent when Lin Banshan easily saw through many things. She didn't notice that Lin Banshan's words about an outsider actually had a deeper meaning. If he was an outsider, then what kind of person was the insider who could solve this problem? Lin Banshan said, Li Xiaotong suggested that you look for the crown prince of the Tai family. If you don't mind, I also want to give you a suggestion. Zhou Yu looked up and asked seriously, please go ahead. Madman Lin Banshan held the remaining wine in his glass and walked out of the door with a smile. He said with indescribable confidence and ease, I remember that you have a good relationship with him. After President Pabre took office, just as the policy critics had analyzed, the Deputy Minister of National Defense, Zhou Yingxing, who was originally mainly in charge of logistics, took the position of the minister. This general, who was only the director of the Federation's National Defense Base 3 years ago, was promoted 3 times in a row in a short time and sat in such a prominent position. It was a very shocking phenomenon. The Zhou family was still sitting in the courtyard in the western suburbs of the capital. In the middle of the night, Zhou Yu tiredly pushed open the door downstairs and walked in. She glanced at her father on the sofa, who was reading the newspaper with glasses on. She thought of the things that Lin Banshan saw through and wanted to say something, but didn't know how to start. In fact, she also had doubts in her heart. A few days ago, in the study, her father intentionally or unintentionally revealed some inside information about the Golden Foundation building incident to her. Then, he allowed her to contact those people in an attempt to rescue Su Lu and that guy. What faction of the military did her father represent by doing this? Sitting in the important position of the Minister of National Defense, there was no doubt that his every move had to be extremely cautious and careful. Was this the real reason why her father was indifferently watching her work? The most important thing was her father doing this under the influence of the madam, or was there some secret instruction from the white official residence? Father, I'm back. Zhou Yu greeted him very politely. Ever since she was pregnant, or after living with Su Lu for a period of time in the Wangdu apartment, the originally cold and unruly young lady's temperament had changed a lot. She may still be the same in her bones, but at least on the surface, she had become much more polite. Minister Zhou nodded. He didn't ask where his daughter went, who she met, or what she did. He just continued to read the newspaper seriously. Zhou Yu knew that she couldn't get more information from her father, so she went upstairs. Minister Zhou, who was sitting on the sofa, looked up and watched his daughter's back as she went upstairs. After a moment of silence, he didn't open his mouth to ask. Instead, he lowered his head again. Zhou Yu's brother, Zhou Yu, got married 3 months ago. He was currently living in a department of the 2nd Military Region of S2. At this time, it was late at night, and the minister's wife was already asleep. The orderlies and waiters had all returned to the dormitory at the back. In this spacious building, it was so quiet that it made people feel a little worried. Back in her bedroom suite, Zhou Yu smiled and whispered a few words to the auntie who was taking care of the child. She asked how the child was doing today. Walking to the bedside, she lowered her body and looked at the little boy's red face in the crib. She couldn't help but smile happily. Zhou Liuhua was almost 10 months old. Although he still couldn't speak, he could occasionally make a few monosyllabic sounds. It seemed like he was calling for his mother, but also seemed like he was calling for his father. The door to the suite closed. Zhou Yu moved a chair and sat beside the crib. She looked at her child quietly and said softly, "You will also be a man in the future. As a man, even if you can't support the heavens, you have to be world-shaking." The corners of her lips curled up into a bright smile. She tilted her head and looked at Lu Hua. She said, "Your 2 fathers have done a world-shaking thing." On the little boy's birth certificate, the name of Su Li's father was recorded in the chip's file. However, his real father by blood was Shi Qinghai. Therefore, it was very appropriate for Zhou Yu to say that they were his 2 fathers. Pulling the soft cotton shirt under the child's chin, Zhou Yu stood up tiredly and rubbed the numbness between her eyebrows. She was indeed very concerned about the 2 fellows who had disappeared without a trace. At the beginning, she didn't know if they were still alive. Now, she was worried about their safety. Would they really be locked up by the Federation for life? Strangely, she was actually more concerned about Su Lu. After all, the face of Shi Qinghai, whom she had a one-night stand with, was a little blurry in her memory. She looked at the dark night outside the window and thought that Su Lu, that stinky rock, must be locked up alone in a small dark room in the Federation's secret prison. Not seeing the light for months, enduring loneliness or torture in the dark and damp, Zhou Yu's expression became worried. She didn't know if he could make it. The most heavily guarded prison in the Federation wasn't the local prosecutor's office, nor was it the top 4 military detention center of the Ministry of National Defense. Instead, it was a military prison in S1 Hulan State. Compared to this military prison, even the legendary Fox Fortress felon prison in space would lose some of its deterrence. It was because this military prison was called Qingcheng. During the Federation's dynasty era, there was an ancient poem that once said that a smile could overturn a country, and another smile could overturn a city. This military prison was named Qingcheng, but it wasn't because of the romantic and artistic atmosphere. Instead, it meant that even if someone tried to overturn a city, no one would be able to save a single person from this prison. This military prison had existed as early as 10,000 years ago during the dynasty era. At that time, it was an important prison used by the emperor to lock up dissidents. Countless years had passed, and Qingcheng prison was constantly reinforced and maintained. It was supplemented by all kinds of advanced surveillance systems and powerful and cold professional soldiers. It was even more sinister and terrifying than before. However, the people locked up in this prison were the same as before. They were all extremely important criminals. Other than the high-ranking military officers who had violated the law, when the Federation government was suppressing the 7 great families, there were also countless powerful and important people who had once lingered here. Those who were locked up in Qingcheng prison basically had no chance to leave. However, there were a few people who occasionally left. In the eyes of the people of the Federation, this experience was something they were most proud of. The people of the Federation didn't understand the essence of Qingcheng prison. Most of them didn't even know where this prison was. However, this didn't affect them from having a certain understanding. Only those who had been in Qingcheng prison were truly important people. Different from what the outside world imagined, the heavily guarded military prison didn't look sinister and terrifying from the outside. A few buildings were scattered randomly on the wasteland by the mountain range. From the outside, there wasn't any high-voltage barbed wire, nor were there any towering sentry towers or advanced surveillance networks. Even fully armed soldiers were rarely seen. However, in reality, Qingcheng prison was under the comprehensive surveillance of the Federal Central Computer. No one knew what kind of dangers were hidden in this seemingly peaceful prison. For countless years, no one had been able to successfully escape from this prison. This was enough to prove that this military prison's reputation was not in vain. Qingcheng prison occupied an extremely large area, but in recent years, the number of serious criminals locked up was extremely small. After all, the politics of the Federation was becoming more and more transparent. There weren't that many important people locked up here. The federal military had always been preparing for the war with the Empire, so there wouldn't be too many serious criminals sent here. The brilliance of the noon sun penetrated the transparent dome of the prison and fell on the ground. In an area separated by a high-hardness material, more than 30 prisoners in prison uniforms were eating lunch. The nutrition for lunch was different. Dozens of serious criminals, old or young, with white hair or shaved heads, had all kinds of expressions on their faces. Some were as lonely as a poet, some were as angry as a poet, and some were as calm and composed as a good poet. Of the serious criminals locked up here, some had killed countless people, some had committed treason. None of them had the extravagant hope of leaving this place alive. During the meal, the atmosphere had become somewhat sparking due to the long period of boredom. However, it was suppressed by the cold soldiers holding the standard taser guns upstairs. As a result, they could only coldly look at each other and look around, using their eyes to emit the smell of blood in their bodies. Clang! Clang! Two dull sounds of metal colliding rang out. The serious criminals in the cafeteria raised their heads almost at the same time, looking toward the passage at the entrance of the prison. The electrically controlled alloy door at the passage slowly opened, revealing a group of people. Four soldiers, who were not equipped with weapons, nervously held the black high-polymer lassos in their hands as if they were facing a great enemy. The front end of the four lassos was tightly tied around a person's neck. A new person had arrived at Qingqing prison. The serious criminals eating at the cafeteria looked over curiously. It should be known that it had been a long time since a qualified prisoner had entered this boring prison. They looked at the new prisoner with smiles. Some of the serious criminals thought that there was finally one more person to talk to, but even more people's eyes revealed a cruel and murderous mood. They thought that there was finally a new person who would bleed and cry to help them pass the time of despair. However, all the emotions in their eyes disappeared a moment after they were cast toward the entrance of the passage. What replaced it was shock and disbelief, and there was also a faint fear and fear. The new prisoner who had his neck restrained by the black lassos was a young man. Although his messy black hair draped over his shoulders like messy grass, making it difficult to tell his exact age, the soft black hair and that pale face still retained the unique vitality of a young man. He had not seen the sun for 5 months, so his face was naturally pale. Naturally, no one took care of his hair. The new prisoner narrowed his eyes and greedily looked at the noon sun through the transparent dome above his head. It was as if he was not worried at all that the blazing sun would burn his retina. His pair of eyes, which were not big to begin with, became 2 thin slits because he squinted too hard. The 4 soldiers who escorted him to the prison saw the prisoner stop where he was. They thought of the strict instructions from their superiors and the terrifying strength of this person in the rumors. Their hearts could not help but shrink nervously. They subconsciously exerted force with their arms at the same time and pulled on the black lassos. The young prisoner, however, seemed to have taken root under his feet. He was steady and did not move at all. He still raised his head and looked at the sun with narrowed eyes for a while. Then he lowered his head and used both hands to push the messy hair hanging by his face to the back of his head, revealing his pale face. Only then did he obediently follow the movements of the soldiers and take a step forward. It was only 1 step, but there was a dull sound of metal clashing where his foot landed. His feet were shackled with electrically controlled magnetic shackles made of alloy. The shackles that reflected the metallic light looked very beautiful, but they weighed as much as 30 kilograms. Especially when they came into contact with the silver tunnel on the ground, the strong magnetic force made the sound even louder. He also wore special electrically controlled handcuffs on his hands. Perhaps it was not quite right to call them handcuffs because the thick and heavy metal rings were worn on his thin arms. They looked very out of place. The thick and heavy handcuffs and shackles, and the pale and thin prisoner, were like the powerless youth in Schiller's play who was bound in a gloomy little house made of iron. As the soldier nervously pulled, the new prisoner frowned and slowly moved his feet forward. With every step he took, he had to fight against the strong magnetic force on the ground, and it was extremely difficult for him to walk. As he slowly walked, the dull and clear sound of metal clashing continuously sounded from under his body, resounding throughout the entire prison. Separated by a transparent material wall, the eyes of the prisoners followed the movements of the new prisoner. The emotions in their eyes had long become incomparable shock and fear. Who was this new prisoner? The prison had actually used a magnetic restriction that had not been used for many years. Some of the prisoners felt a chill in their hearts because they could clearly see that in the heavy magnetic shackles on the new prisoner's body, the red light of an electrically controlled explosion was constantly lit. Chapter 305. The felons in Qingqing prison had experienced too much darkness in their past. Now that they had spent too much time inside these four walls, even if they couldn't see through life and death, they could at least see through life and death. The status and position they had before they were imprisoned did not matter after they were imprisoned. For them, the only factor that determined their social status and the strength of their words, other than the combat strength or brains they had displayed during the long years of despair, was the most simple way to distinguish them was the importance the Federation attached to the prisoner. The initial shock gradually faded from the felons' eyes. They quietly looked at the young prisoner who was walking with difficulty on the other side of the transparent partition and put down the plastic utensils in their hands in unison. Some of them were extremely vicious and had once been bound with a remote control device. However, dangerous devices like this that could explode instantly had only been seen in prison studies. In addition to the somewhat exaggeratedly shaped handcuffs and shackles, the felons in the canteen could easily tell that the Federation government placed a lot of importance on this new prisoner. They even felt that they placed a lot of importance on this new prisoner compared to everyone else in the canteen combined. It was because of this judgment that they knew that this seemingly thin and weak young prisoner must have done a lot of terrible things in the outside world to receive this kind of treatment. The social class division in Qingqing prison was just this simple. They naturally felt a sense of awe towards this young prisoner. However, after all, they were separated by a transparent material and the young prisoner was walking with great difficulty, so they slowly suppressed this feeling. The plastic utensils were also specially made. Even if the felons secretly took them away, no matter how they broke and polished them, they couldn't fix a sharp angle. A white-haired, bespectacled man who looked like a professor turned around. Hearing the heavy metal clanging sounds behind his head, he shook his head and placed a small spoon beside the lunch box. He said quietly, "Look at the color of that person's face and lips. I'm afraid he hasn't seen the sun for 3 months." Before this felon was imprisoned, he was a professor in the Federation's Military Science Academy 3rd Department. Because of a trivial matter in his family, he poured the Empire's poisonous gas sample that the Federation imitated into the villa where his wife and parents-in-law lived. This excellent biochemist's judgment in this aspect had long been recognized by the felons in Qingqing prison. Therefore, after hearing this sentence, the felons in the canteen began to discuss softly. 3 months of solitary confinement? That's too inhumane. A burly man with a shaved head sighed and said, "Back then, I almost went crazy after a month." Everyone in the cafeteria knew that this seemingly simple-minded brute had once gone on a rampage in the recruit camp and killed 7 recruits in a row. If it wasn't for the Ministry of National Defense wanting to use him as a test subject in the future, or to be sent to the West Woods as a suicide squad, the military court would have ordered him to be executed long ago. Hearing the word inhumane from the mouth of such a vicious felon should have caused a roar of laughter, but none of these felons laughed. They only quietly looked at the young prisoner who was struggling to move on the other side of the transparent material with complicated gazes. Because they had all been imprisoned in solitary confinement before, they knew how unbearable it was to not see the light of day, to not hear anyone speak, to be surrounded by silence, as if they were absolutely dead. The new young prisoner had been held in solitary confinement for 3 months. These vicious and treacherous felons couldn't help but shiver in their hearts. The importance that the Federation placed on this young prisoner had already indirectly proven how dangerous this person was. If he was locked up for 3 months and turned into a lunatic, living with everyone in the future, no one is to provoke this new young master. A voice sounded from the middle of the table. The voice was hoarse and slightly old. The owner of the voice clearly had an extremely high position among the felons in the military prison. When he said this, the 30 or so prisoners nodded lightly at the same time. These criminals who had committed heinous crimes knew better than anyone that one could not judge a book by its cover. A gentle professor could kill his own family, a simple and honest man could slaughter the entire recruit camp. This young prisoner who had just arrived, although he had a thin body and a pale face, they knew that he was an absolutely dangerous person just by looking at his opening actions today. Moreover, since he had been confined in solitary confinement for 3 months, they were afraid that he had long gone crazy. The dull and clear sound of heavy metal clashing finally stopped. The people in the cafeteria no longer had to endure this kind of torture, and they gently let out a breath. The young prisoner passed through the 3 safety gates and arrived at the prison's inner room. The 4 black nooses were loosened, but the magnetic heavy shackles and handcuffs were still on his body. The prison didn't arrange for him to eat in the cafeteria. Instead, they arranged a single table and chair for him on the magnetic floor of the isolated area. The table was filled with food and fruit. This special treatment didn't make the felons who stared at him feel jealousy. Instead, they felt even colder. They were more and more certain that the new prisoner was extremely dangerous. Right at this time, the young prisoner who sat on the chair with difficulty fiddled with his messy hair again. He then turned around and smiled towards the felons in the cafeteria. On his pale and thin face, the smile was incomparably clean and natural. It was dazzling like the sun, sincere and sincere. He didn't look like a dangerous person who hid madness within his calm at all. He looked just like an ordinary boy next door. The young prisoner's sinister coldness formed a stark contrast with this smile. Those felons were shocked to the point of being speechless. Even the vigilant guards around the young prisoner and the guards on the 2nd and 3rd floors who were completely focused on aiming felt a sense of relaxation that they shouldn't have felt. Sulu didn't know that his earlier smile had almost overturned a city in Qingqing prison. It had shocked the guards and prisoners who were on guard against a great enemy. He was just acting according to his usual attitude in life. When he came to a strange place, he would put on a sincere smile to make the people around him happier and to make himself less troublesome. However, he obviously didn't expect that he was now in a military prison that was heavily guarded. The people he smiled at were not a group of normal people. After finishing his first meal in Qingqing prison, he was sent back to his cell. He was still locked up alone, but the layout and facilities in this cell were much better than those in the previous prison. Sulu touched the neat bedding on the bed and went inside to test the sitting position of the toilet. He smiled happily. Only when he saw his pale face and messy hair in the mirror did his smile gradually fade. After being locked up alone for 4 months, he couldn't see the sun. The roots of his hair grew crazily as if they were unsupervised. It actually went past his shoulders. I hope the government will let me get a haircut. He looked at himself in the mirror and suddenly thought of when he was in Donglin a few years ago. After deceiving Bao Longtao, he had also stared blankly at his own face in the mirror. However, at that time, he would be extremely nervous over such a matter. Now, he was in the Federation's most terrifying secret military prison, but his mood was as calm as if he was at home. He narrowed his eyes. He just didn't understand why the government would suddenly release him from that dark cell. Why would they transfer him from Fox Fortress to Qingqing prison? After washing his face with hot water, Sulu sat on the bed in his cell. He lowered his head and recalled those 100 days. He couldn't help but feel a chill in his heart. Loneliness was indeed the most unbearable thing in the world. Compared to this, although this military prison was also a solitary confinement, at least there was light. He could see people when he was eating. For him, this was already a rare enjoyment. He lowered his head and recalled every minute and second of those unbearable days. Then, he lay back on the soft bed and stared at the monotonous ceiling above his head with narrowed eyes. He always felt that the light yellow ceiling gradually became a mass of darkness in his eyes. Other than a few meteorites that occasionally floated by in the distance, there was nothing else. After being arrested in the Peace Foundation building 4 months ago, he and Shi Qinghai were locked up separately by the Federation. He was taken away by the 2nd Military Region that night. After undergoing the necessary medical treatment and related procedures, he was locked up in Fox Fortress Special Prison. Fox Fortress was a space prison located at the outer edge of the S2 system. It faced the direction of the dark sky curtain. Outside the alloy surface of the prison was an ice-cold vacuum. In that kind of environment, wanting to escape was basically wishful thinking. Sulu, who was locked up in the space prison, didn't have the urge to escape as a serious criminal under strict supervision. In fact, he just wanted someone to interrogate him. However, no one interrogated him, no one questioned him. There were no cockroaches or ants in the solitary dark cell. Even the most hated rats on spaceships weren't present. There was only silence and food that was automatically delivered at regular intervals. For an entire 141 days, he was alone in the darkness. There wasn't a single sound in the room. Only the endless darkness of the universe outside the small window watched him. In that region of heaven, it was difficult to even find a single unblinking star. Other than darkness, there was still darkness. Other than silence, there was still silence. It was so dark that even his teeth were black. It was so quiet that he could often hear his own heartbeat. He always felt like it was beating a drum. Being in that dark, silent, and lonely environment for more than 4 months was not a mental torture that a human could endure. During this long period of time, his injuries had mostly healed, but his face began to pale. His body, which lacked the light of the stars, also became somewhat weak. Just as the serious criminals in Allure prison had determined, a few months of solitary confinement would drive anyone crazy. However, it was obvious that Sulu wasn't crazy. He was still healthy and living normally. This was somewhat inconceivable. Even if his nerves were thicker than normal people's, even if he was a famous stinky rock in Donglin, how did he survive? I don't know if Mr. Sure can survive. He was already far away from the darkness and loneliness. Lying comfortably on the soft bed in Allure prison, he worriedly thought. After lying down for a long time, perhaps he felt that it was too boring. He rubbed his eyes and softly muttered to himself, "Old geezer. Old geezer, get me 2 romance movies." A young man came to Allure prison, and the security level was immediately raised. However, other than that, the forbidden area in the wasteland didn't seem to have changed much. The serious criminals who were locked up followed an extremely detailed schedule: eating, bathing, reading, exercising, learning the laws of the Federation, and then sleeping. It was exactly the same as before. The only difference was that every day when they were eating, they could always hear the dull sound of metal clashing. The new prisoner wearing heavy magnetic shackles with a remote control explosive device would, accompanied by this noise, pass through a special passage and head to his own small table to eat. Sulu and the rest of the serious criminals were separated by a layer of transparent material, but it was like they were in 2 different worlds. Other than the noise and his existence, they didn't interfere with each other. However, every 3 meals, he would habitually nod at the serious criminals who had the temperament of a poet, smile, and silently greet them. These days continued for a week. Among the serious criminals who ate in the cafeteria, there was finally someone who responded to his good intentions and smiled at him. As a result, this unfortunate gentleman was locked up in a solitary cell and stayed there for 3 days. Even though after this serious criminal came out, he still stubbornly cursed at the fully armed soldiers upstairs, but he never looked at Sulu again. The Federation government allowed Sulu to see the light of day through the transparent dome, but they still used force to prevent him from having any contact with the outside world. The outside world referred to here was everyone other than him, even including the prisoners in the same prison. At night, when he was alone in a solitary cell in Allure prison, Sulu would often stand by the window and look at the wild green grass below. Sometimes, he would associate it with his hair that was like grass, and sometimes, he would think that it was already late spring. He had spent too much time alone in Foxfort's dark room, so he actually felt like he had lost track of time. The prison refused his request to shave his head. To be more precise, no soldier in charge of guarding him dared to speak to him. Fortunately, he still had the old thing. The structural diagram of the Golden Foundation building and the real-time positioning cursor in his left eye had long disappeared without a trace. His left eye could not really see ghosts. At the beginning of the 100 Days of Darkness in Foxfort Space Prison, Sulu pulled out the data stored in his mind and reviewed it. He also looked at the various pictures of beautiful women in his mind, but he still felt bored. In his boredom, he tried to initiate contact with the existence on the other side of the black dream again. This kind of request was very familiar to Sulu. It was roughly equivalent to a mentally ill person constantly shouting to the mountains and seas in his mind, and then hoping to hear an echo. Therefore, in the dark and lonely days that could drive people crazy, Sulu contacted the glory of the charter that was all over the universe. He began to use his left eye to watch the television news or soap operas on the Federation. He also watched a lot of artistic movies that he usually did not have time to watch. It was through this extremely mysterious method that no one could investigate that Sulu saw the consequences of Macklin's death in the Federation from the Federation's news. Those demonstrations, strikes, and riots lasted until last month before gradually subsiding. Therefore, Sulu never understood why the Federation government was not in a hurry to put him on trial to quell the anger and desire for revenge of those George Carlin fanatics. Instead, they forgot him in a corner of the universe. What he did not understand was why the government sent him back to the surface at this time. This kind of confusion lasted until the arrival of the first visitor to the prison. This morning, Sulu lowered his head and sat on the cold metal chair in the reception room. He looked at the heavy magnetic shackles on his ankles. When he heard the sound of the door opening, he raised his head and saw a person who was not unfamiliar, but could not be said to be familiar either. In an instant, he smiled and frowned. He felt as if time had turned back to a year ago. Chapter 306. A year ago, Sulu used a Taiping axe to cleave out the fork in his life. At the time, he was locked up in the military prison of the Ministry of Defense. The Ministry of Defense appointed a legal officer named Su Songzi as his lawyer. So today, when he saw this unfamiliar and beautiful face that carried traces of memories in the reception room of Qingqing military prison, he felt as if time had turned back to a year ago. It was as if all the anger, sadness, depression, passion, and bloody stories of the past year had never happened. The trees on both sides of the road leading to the district attorney's office were still softly crying out for the arrival of spring. Su Songzi, a legal officer of the Ministry of Defense's Internal Affairs Department, sat calmly and indifferently across the table. She took out a few documents from a thick folder and pushed them along the smooth surface of the table in front of Sulu. She said, "Sulu, I represent the Ministry of Defense to inform you that because you are involved in the 680118A case, all of your authority in the General Assembly base has been removed. The Ministry of Defense has appointed me as your legal advisor. My name is Su Songzi." Su Songzi looked at the handcuffs on Su Li's wrists across the table. She had no intention of reaching out to shake his hand. Her brows furrowed slightly as she said, "We've met before. If you don't have any objections, please sign these legal documents." He had been secretly locked up by the Federation for nearly 5 months without any interrogation. However, in these few days, he had been transferred from Fox Fortress to the military prison on the surface. The Ministry of Defense sent a legal officer, and suddenly, everything seemed to have started working again. Sulu couldn't quite react in time. He narrowed his eyes at the legal documents on the table. He didn't say anything as he carefully read them. The alloy handcuffs slid across the white paper, producing a rustling sound. After carefully reading all of the words on the legal documents, Sulu finally raised his head. He nodded at Su Songzi and then took the pen she handed over. With some difficulty, he moved his hands and seriously signed his name. Su Songzi looked at him calmly. Only when he signed his name did she let out a slight sigh of relief. She stood up and said, "The case has already entered the legal process. I'll come back the day after tomorrow." "Thank you," Sulu replied very seriously. "Can I ask a few questions?" "Yes, but I may not be able to help you except for legal matters." Su Songzi still maintained a professional and serious expression, but a strange light flashed in his eyes, as if he wanted to warn Su Lu of something. Su Lu asked, "It's the person who was arrested by the Federation with me. Can I know where he is now?" "No." Su Songzi answered straightforwardly, and then began to tidy up the documents on the table. Su Lu noticed that her eyes quickly blinked the moment she lowered her head, and his heart suddenly relaxed. Under surveillance, legal officer Su Lu naturally could not tell Su Lu what he wanted to know, such as where Shi Qinghai was. However, she could at least tell Su Lu if someone was still alive. In fact, that was what he was most concerned about. Watching the beautiful female officer walk out of the door of the interrogation room, Su Lu suddenly remembered that half a year ago, this female officer was transferred to the Macklin Special Task Force. Before he took action, he heard that after the Special Task Force was disbanded, several prosecutors who insisted on continuing the investigation were framed by the Federation Investigation Bureau and had their freedom temporarily restricted, including prosecutor Xiao Wenjing. He did not know how these people were doing now. Walking along the long corridor, Su Songzi was strictly checked along the way. All the legal documents and personal belongings that she had brought into the interrogation room, as well as all the hard objects such as pens and hair clips, were all checked. Only then was Su Songzi able to leave this extremely tightly monitored military prison. The military vehicle that had been waiting at the main entrance of the prison roared in the direction of the Wasteland Military Airport. Su Songzi sat in the back and did not speak to the soldier in front of her. Instead, she thought about the scene in the prison interrogation room and felt a little depressed. In the interrogation room, Su Li's hair was messy, his face was pale, and his body was thin. It made her feel that life was really not fair. As a member of the Macklin Special Task Force, she knew better than anyone the crimes that Macklin had committed. When Xiao Wenjing and two other prosecutors who insisted on secretly investigating were arrested by the Federation Investigation Bureau for that shameless crime, she felt disappointed in the Federation government and the military for the first time. However, the big shots in the Federation had reached a compromise with Macklin. What could she, a low-level officer, do? Therefore, when she heard the explosive news of Macklin's assassination in January, she could not help but sigh at the cycle of life and karma. After Macklin's death, the compromise of the investigation against him naturally did not need to be mentioned again. The Federation Investigation Bureau released the prosecutors, and chief editor Bob and reporter Wood of the Capital Daily were no longer under the pressure of the Federation. Su Songzi had to admit that these happy changes were all thanks to the two terrorists that the demonstrators wanted to tear into pieces. As for the assassination in the Foundation building in January that shocked the Federation, it was not until a few days ago that she found out that one of the murderers involved was actually Su Lu, who she had dealt with before. She was very clear about Su Li's background in the Federation and his complicated relationship with Minister Zhou Yingxing, so she did not understand why he would do such a thing. In the past 2 nights, she would occasionally ask herself, and she found that she really wanted to thank Su Lu. For what he had done, she had even developed a sense of admiration that a legal worker and a soldier should never have. Su Songzi looked at the airport building in front of the glass and thought of the minister who was waiting for her report in the Capital Special District. She calmed down a little and lowered her head to deal with the legal documents. Su Lu was an active soldier in the Federation, and the crimes he committed were so shocking. Whether it was from the perspective of confidentiality or from the perspective of procedural laws, his case would definitely be handled in secret by the military court. She was very clear that a legal person like her, or even the Federation law itself, would not play any role in Su Li's life or death. The power that could really decide the life or death of the pale, small-eyed man was in the white official residence in the Capital Special District or on the Parliament Hill. She came here today to release a signal to Su Lu, who had been isolated from news for a long time, to let him know that something was happening. Unfortunately, under the strict surveillance of Qingqing prison, she could not say anything. She only hoped that Su Lu could understand the purpose of her visit this time. after returning from the interrogation room to the solitary cell, Su-le sat on the edge of the bed and lowered his head in silence for a long time. The message that the female legal officer brought was actually very simple. That was, the higher-ups of the Federation had begun to reconsider Macklin's assassination case, and the trial was about to begin. This was not bad news. On the contrary, the dark residence that happened a few months ago was really scary. It was just that he could not understand one thing: he killed Macklin, so the Thai family would definitely give up on him, and that Madam would definitely kill him without mercy. Even if the Federation government still misunderstood the relationship between him and Minister Zhou, no matter how he looked at it, the law of the Federation and the will of the government would not allow him to continue living. What exactly went wrong? When he was arrested in the Golden Foundation building, Su-le thought that he was going to die, but he did not expect that he had lived for so long. He racked his brains to find an answer to why he did not die, but he still could not find a reason why he should have been alive. This was because he would never have thought that Macklin, who had crossed thousands of mountains and rivers, faced a hail of bullets, and killed with a single stroke, actually had a terrifying identity that had been hidden for decades. Regarding this, the Federal Central Computer under the Bureau of Proclamation strictly followed the regulations of the Charter and the level of authority, and did not let him know the slightest bit. It was precisely because of Macklin's true identity that Su-le and Shi Qinghai's action of killing Macklin could be interpreted as light or dark, two completely different meanings. It could be a terrorist who deserved to die, or a hero who saved the Federation. It all depended on what the big shots thought. Capital Special Region, President's Residence. Below the President's residence, in the Central Operations Command Room of the Federation, 2 rows of ultra-thin extended light screens glowed with a faint blue light, and a solemn mood filled the room. The Special Task Force agents standing at the entrance of the passage had eagle eyes, and the big shots sitting around the long conference table had solemn expressions as they listened attentively to the explanation and watched the constantly changing images on the light screens. The Minister of Defense and the Minister of Finance of the new Federation Government Cabinet were present at the meeting. The members of the Federal Military Joint Chiefs of Staff were all present, and the commanders of the 2nd and 3rd military regions sat solemnly below General Miles. Even Commander Zhong, who was nervously preparing for war on the front lines in the West Woods, and Hong Yuliang, the Commander-in-Chief of the Federal Fleet, who had been stationed in the Night Scorpion Nebula for the past 6 months, also participated in this meeting via video call. The reason why so many important people of the Federation had gathered in the Operations Command Room of the President's residence today was because they were going to listen to the investigation report of a case today. The Bureau of Proclamation, relying on the powerful information-gathering ability of the glory of the Charter and the huge amount of data archived in the central database, still took nearly 5 months to fully investigate this case. In a sense, this case had almost brought irreparable damage to the Federation, and the investigation report of this case, to a certain extent, would also determine the Federation's strategic attitude toward the Empire. In front of the long conference table, President Pabre, who had a dark complexion, was carefully reading the investigation report in his hands as he listened to the explanations that came from time to time. In front of him was an inconspicuous pen, which was stored in a vacuum box made of superhard material, and the blood stains on it had long since disappeared. The Special Task Force of the 2nd Military Region went deep into the Green Dragon Mountains and took the risk to obtain the biological marker on the bones of the Mai couple. A middle-aged man wearing glasses operated the display terminal and enlarged a picture on the screen. He continued, after comparing this mark with the biological marker on Macklin that was archived in the Federation's Investigation Bureau, we confirmed that they were not related by blood. As the assistant director of the Bureau of Proclamation, Cui Zhedong often represented the old director in secret government meetings, but it was the first time that he had encountered such a big scene, so he could not help but feel a little nervous. His voice was slightly hoarse as he continued, after the 680118A case, we took a sample from Macklin's body and conducted a second check, confirming this conclusion again. President Pabre did not raise his head. He only waved his hand, indicating for him to continue. Director Feng of the Bureau of Proclamation, who had been sitting silently to the right of the president, slowly opened his eyes. He glanced at Cui Zhedong, then released his old fingers from his crutch and gently tapped on the smooth wood silently. Seeing this action, Cui Zhedong did not know why, but he felt much calmer. He changed the picture on the screen and explained in a low voice, before the incident, the Bureau of Proclamation had already used its authority to send a special task force of the West Woods military region to infiltrate the 100 Mu Star region in an attempt to obtain some relevant information from that year. Although it was a little late, the special task force still managed to obtain a list of names, confirming that in the second last year of the 36th constitutional calendar, the Bermuda Human Trafficking Organization. Following Cui Zhedong's voice, the atmosphere in the command room, which was glowing with a light blue light, became more and more strange. Although the big shots of the Federation sitting at the table had already received the notice from the Bureau of Proclamation after the attack on the 388-60118 Foundation building and had also seen the relevant top-secret files, in fact, they still had some thoughts in their hearts. They hoped that the Bureau of Proclamation's investigation was wrong. Medellin was indeed dead, but the problems he had caused were still ongoing. Previously, everyone has already seen the video of Medellin's private meeting with that person from the Empire. Cui Zhedong glanced at the silent big shots of the Federation and said seriously, the basic context has been sorted out. Here, I will make a report to everyone. After the first assault between the Federation and the Empire, in order to break through the blockade of the glory of the Charter, constructed a strange and exceptionally whimsical plan. They prepared a batch of newborn babies through the human trafficking organization in the Bermuda Star region. Taking advantage of the loopholes in the Federation's laws in this regard, they sold them to parents in the Federation who needed them. Among them was one of the babies. For the time being, we will name him Number 1. Person Number 1 grew up under the care of his adoptive parents in the Federation. According to the relevant privacy regulations, this pair of parents easily applied for an identity chip for this baby who was not even half a year old. From that moment on, this baby became a citizen of the Federation. In the 23rd year of the constitutional calendar, Target Number 1 joined the army and participated in the expeditionary force against the Empire. He received the Purple Star Medal. We believe that Target Number 1 still does not know his true identity until now. He even disobeyed the orders of his superiors to retreat because of his hatred for the Empire. In the 27th year of the constitutional calendar, Target Number 1 was in the most difficult period of his life. His business failed and his father passed away. It was also in this year that he unexpectedly received a funding from an unknown source and entered the Faculty of History and Economics of the Capital University. We now know that he received a strange invitation to go to Bermuda to meet an important person from the Empire. Chapter 307. There were very few people in the Battle Command who knew Macklin's secret identity in advance, but some of them only knew today for the first time, so they could not hide the shock in their hearts. Their expressions were extremely ugly, and their hands on the table nervously rubbed together. We believe that through the comparison results of the biological markers, as well as some evidence deliberately left by the Empire can easily convince him that he is one of them. From a national warrior of the Federation to one of the Empire's most deeply buried spies, what kind of psychological struggle Macklin went through, and how the Empire convinced him to fight for their cause, we have no way of knowing, because he is already dead, and can no longer speak of it. In the 31st year of the constitutional calendar, he organized the Veterans Association to occupy Charter Square and was expelled back to S2. This should be the beginning of his attempt to complete the mission given to him by the Empire. In the following 4 years, he has been trying to enter the political system of the Federation through the Federation's election, but he has always failed. According to post-analysis, under such circumstances, he confirmed that he could not complete his mission, so he chose to enter Green Dragon Mountain and start from the anti-government army. It must be admitted that he did very well. He used 15 years to become an important figure in the Central Committee of the Anti-Government Army, and had enough status within Green Dragon Mountain. Then, he proposed nonviolent non-cooperation, and went around in a circle, still wanting to enter the political system of the Federation. In the end, he succeeded. Cui Zhedong was seriously reporting the case. To be more precise, what he was doing now was more like telling a story from the distant past of Macklin. The story was so bizarre, but the meaning hidden in it was so terrifying that the big shots of the Federation in the command center of the president's residence subconsciously maintained absolute silence. They watched the pictures or videos of Macklin flashing on the light beam in silence. In the 58th year of the constitutional calendar, he began to run for the parliament of the 4 states around the mountains, and then he spent nearly 10 years, using his influence in the Federation and his advocacy of nonviolence, step by step into the core area of the Federation. Cui Zhedong looked at President Pabre and said seriously, "It seems that this is the most dangerous step for the Federation." Over the past 10 years, Senator Macklin had been shuttling between S1-S2 and S1-S2. Apart from the fanatics who had always followed him, he also had many unclear relationships with the big shots in the upper echelons of the Federation. This person had always been spying on them in the dark as a spy of the Empire. Nobody knew how much confidential information he had obtained from the Federation in these interactions. The key was that the people he was in contact with were the Federation's unshakable upper echelons. There were even 1 or 2 of them sitting in the command center. Although the Bureau of Proclamation was independent of the internal checks and balances of the government, it was basically impossible for them to investigate to the extreme. If all the people that Senator Medellin had come into contact with were treated as suspects, then a large part of the Federation government and Parliament Hill might collapse. Go straight to the conclusion. President Pabre still had his head lowered. The metal pen in the transparent vacuum box before him glowed faintly. Target number 1, Macklin, is a spy the Empire sent to the Federation many years ago. He successfully hid from the glory of the Charter and tore open a large hole in the Federation's electronic surveillance network, causing unimaginable damage to us. Cui Zhedong said in a low voice, "The Charter computer has already determined that this is a second-order incident. The level of damage is controllable." After saying this, he turned off the display device in front of him and silently sat behind Director Pai. Only now did President Pabre raise his head. He glanced at the people in the room and said in a low and powerful voice, "Everyone, speak. Senator Macklin is actually a spy for the Empire. If the Bureau of Proclamation hadn't produced so much evidence, I don't think anyone here would believe it. Thinking back, I've met him before, and I admired his peaceful ideals." The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Miles, didn't try to clear his name. As the most powerful figure in the federal military, if he was fooled by Macklin, then it would naturally clear the worries of more people. 70 years ago, during the first contact between the Federation and the Empire had already started such a plan. Other than sending babies into the Federation, they really couldn't find any other way to break through the blockade of the glory of the Charter. General Miles looked at the pen on the table and said coldly, "Fortunately, Macklin didn't have time to send these things out." His expression was solemn and stern. He said coldly, "The entire Federation was kept in the dark by him, and they even let him get the Purple Star Medal. This is a disgrace to the Federation. Fortunately, he died before he tried to escape from the Federation. Otherwise, most of the people in this room would have killed themselves, including me. This pen contains the specific data of the Federation's 2 major spatial passages. It is because the Federation tightly controlled these 2 spatial passages that the initiative of the war in the West Woods and Bermuda has always been in our hands. If Macklin had sent this information to the Empire, the Federation would have been caught off guard and would have suffered a great loss. It is even possible that the West Woods would have been handed over to the Empire. Secretary of Defense Zhou Yingxing, who had been silent all this time, opened his mouth to explain the real danger of Macklin's incident to the other high-ranking officials present today. As soon as this was said, the high-ranking officials in the underground command center felt their hearts tighten, and they felt more and more shocked. I don't think this is a disgrace to the Federation. Through the human trafficking organization in Bermuda, they imported babies with their blood into the Federation, and then found a suitable method to wake up these sleeping children, tearing open a crack in the Federation. It has to be said that as early as 70 years ago, the Empire had already started this plan. Their patience and forbearance were exceptionally terrifying, and it also made people respect and fear them. Director Tai of the Bureau of Proclamation slowly opened his eyes and said, "The Empire's plan is very good and very powerful. They spent several decades to set it up, and even the chess pieces they set up didn't know their own identities in the beginning." When Macklin received the Purple Star Medal, he must have been a Federation warrior who hated the Empire to the core. However, after he found out his true identity, he was naturally different. I really admire the person who designed this plan on the Empire's side. I believe that after so many years, he should be dead. However, the power of this plan is starting to show, Director Tai said calmly. Just Medellin alone has almost put the Federation in an unknown danger, said Director Ling indifferently. Who can guarantee that the Empire only sent one Macklin? If there are still 20 or 30 Macklins hiding in the Federation government, how should we deal with them? Based on the President's temporary authorization and the authority of the Bureau of Proclamation, in the past 5 months, the Bureau of Proclamation, with the cooperation of the Department of Defense's 3rd Division and the Federation's Investigation Bureau, sorted out the various major organizations in the Federation. Based on the archived data from the central database, we monitored 3,671 suspects. In the end, we confirmed that there were 7 Federation citizens who could be seeds that the Empire had continuously infiltrated into the Federation over the past few years. I call them seeds because once they are watered and fertilized by the Empire, they will bloom poisonous flowers in the Federation's land. The director of the Bureau of Proclamation said slowly. His tone was very calm, but it was filled with an extremely cold feeling. As the guardian of the Federation's the glory of the Charter, he felt admiration and vigilance toward the Empire's terrifying plan that had been hidden for several decades. However, more than that, he was filled with a murderous intent to completely destroy the other party's plan. When he was speaking, no one in the conference room interrupted. Even President Pabre maintained a silent listening posture. What is slightly reassuring is that the 7 seeds that have been confirmed are now only ordinary citizens of the Federation. When the Empire designed this plan, they must have already considered the problem of the extremely low success rate. These 7 people have not had the opportunity to come into contact with any important departments in the Federation. Among them, 6 of them have never even left the Federation and have never come into contact with people from the Empire. Therefore, we believe that they have not been triggered. Here, I would like to turn around and talk about Senator Macklin. Director Ying's hands gently stroked his walking stick. His expression was solemn as he said, "After the investigation, we will look at this person's entire life in reverse order. My respect for him has reached the extreme." If he could influence or find out about the operation secrets of the Federation's electronic surveillance network, the Empire would lose the layer of glory that they feared the most when they invaded again. On the screen above, the Vice President of the Federation, Byron, had an unusually solemn expression. According to the relevant regulations of the Federation government, he and President Pabre would rarely appear in the same place. He had also attended this important meeting remotely. Now that he knew that his competitor was a spy of the Empire and knew that the position of vice president hid such a problem, he could not help but feel heavy-hearted. The 7 seeds that have been confirmed are already under full surveillance. There will not be any more problems. If the Federation government passes the relevant laws, the Bureau of Proclamation will be able to arrest them immediately. Director C coughed softly and continued speaking. The investigation of Macklin's case has also come to an end. No matter what his true identity is, the fact that he was able to obtain these two spatial maps and this chip proves that the Federation's internal affairs are already rotten to an unbearable extent. In this operation, we have already arrested 314 officials and soldiers who are suspected of leaking secrets to Macklin. A thick chill flashed across Director C's face. Although they have been crying out for justice, and although they still do not know that Macklin is a spy of the Empire, even if Macklin really becomes the Vice President of the Federation, it is still a great crime for them to leak such top-secret information to him. I suggest that the trial of these people be carried out in secret by the military court, and that they be convicted according to the boundaries of the higher authorities, Director C said coldly with his head lowered. Macklin had operated in the Green Dragon Mountain and the Federation for so many years. Relying on his reputation and status, as well as the possible title of Vice President, there were countless government officials and soldiers who were willing to leak certain information to him. Although they did not know that Macklin was a spy of the Empire, in reality, he posed a great threat to the Federation. Hearing Director C's words, the high-ranking officials and generals in the command center all felt a chill at the same time. More than 300 people from the government and military had been isolated, investigated, and sentenced at the same time. Without a doubt, this was the biggest purge in the history of the Federation. However, none of these important figures dared to raise any questions. This was because if a cold purge was not carried out, the negative influence that Macklin, the most terrifying spy of the Empire, had caused within the Federation would be difficult to eliminate. Furthermore, it was only natural that the officials involved in the leak would have to pay the price for the safety of the Federation. Everyone, in January of this year, the Federation was only a few hours away from the danger of being destroyed. Director C raised his head and looked coldly at the people present. He slowly took in a deep breath and said, "The Bureau of Proclamation did not have any reason to suspect him. It was all due to the independent analysis and hints of the central computer. However, he was a candidate for vice president after all. The Bureau of Proclamation's investigation was obstructed by many things. Furthermore, I have to admit that the Bureau of Proclamation was tied down by politics. They wanted to obtain irrefutable evidence and did not take any decisive measures against him. This was the Bureau of Proclamation's biggest mistake. They sought too much stability, but they did not expect that Macklin was prepared to abandon everything in the Federation and leave decisively," the old man said in a cold voice. The old director said in a cold voice, "Fortunately, someone killed him before he left. He died just like that." The old man changed the topic and said with a smile, "In the past few months, before I fell asleep, every time I thought that Macklin was dead, I would feel extremely happy and relaxed. It's good that he died." Minister Zhou glanced at the old man inconspicuously from the corner of his eyes. His heart trembled slightly. Macklin, the seed of the Empire, had bloomed poisonous flowers in the soil of the Federation. However, before he could start sowing, he was directly uprooted by two unreasonable farmers. You're tuning in to the Blissful Bookshelf YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.